Imagine a world where emperors dream beneath stars reflected in marble fountains, and entire cities whisper secrets into the night. What if the rise and fall of one of the most powerful empires on earth wasn't told in war cries, but in the hush of bedtime? Tonight, we travel back to the golden courts of the Mughal Empire, where silk rustled, wisdom bloomed, and even history took a deep breath before sleeping. If you love falling asleep to forgotten empires and calming tales from the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more sleepy journeys through boring but beautiful history. Let's close our eyes and wander where the books forgot to linger. You begin in a high valley, where snowmelt carves slow ribbons across stony ground and orchards cling to slopes with more faith than soil. Before it was a dynasty, before it was an empire, the story of the Mughals was a pattern of water and stone, of herders who knew when to move and scribes who knew when to stamp a seal. You stand in your imagination in Fergana at the end of the 15th century, where a young Timurid prince learned the bland rhythms that keep small kingdoms upright, how to apportion water to wheat and to apricots, how to pay horsemen when the treasury has more promises than coins, how to say yes to cousins without saying yes to their ambitions. He was called Zahiruddin Muhammad Babur, and like the irrigation channels that must be cleaned each spring, his path was a matter of regular work, digging, shoring, keeping the water moving even when it slipped away. The details of those early days are not the explosions of epic. They are lists and routines. Stable boys brushing ice crystals from a horse's coat in pre-dawn dim. Accountants peering at notched sticks and folding papers in leather wraps. A cook stirring a pot of qual. Millet porridge too thin, as always because the wheat had been traded away to buy the next month's fodder. Babur's first kingdom, Fergana, was a place where lordship smelled less like perfume and more like damp straw and warm iron, where the surest sign of strength was a granary locked through winter. When he looked west to Samarkand, he saw not only the blue domes of Timur city, but the infrastructure behind them, qanats that turned desert into garden, caravanserais spaced like beads on a string, and a bureaucracy trained to count and count again. To take that city, he would need not only courage, but lists of names, lists of rations, lists of debts. In those lists lay the shape of a future empire. He went anyway. Too young by most measures, with too few men and too many hopes. The campaign for Samarkand was a tangle of small decisions rather than one large one, or to camp each night to find forage without stripping the ground bare, which a lie to trust for 3 days but not for 4. How to arrange the march column so that the pack camels did not block the arquebusiers and the horses did not trample the spare bowstrings. When he first entered the city, briefly victorious, the smoke of little cooking fires along the alleys would have smelled like triumph to his younger self, but the real business of holding Samarkand was the unglamorous work of making sure the bread ovens fired in the morning and the gates were closed at dusk. He could not keep it long. The steppe produced a new rhythm under the Shabanid Uzbeksa drumbeat of consolidation, and Babur found his lists dwindling. Fewer coins, fewer allies, fewer sacks of barley in the storerooms. You follow him south, and then east, not as a hero fleeing, but as a manager seeking a viable spreadsheet row. Kabul offered that row. The city was no great capital, but it was defensible, and it had wheat enough and mountain passes that could be closed with a few gates and a timely snowfall. When Babur took Kabul in 1504, he acquired the kind of steadiness a man needs to make plans again. The caravan routes that crossed the city carried wool, dried fruit, lapis, and stories. Administratively, Kabul meant something even more prosaic: a place to issue orders and have them followed, a pound of copper that could be minted into coins, a revenue cycle tied to harvests that could be estimated rather than guessed. If you stand outside Kabul's walls in your mind, You almost hear the creak of water wheels lifting stream water into terraced gardens. The rhythmic thud of stamps, sealing letters, the more subtle sound of a system coming into tune. From Kabul, Babur raided into the plains. He rode out through the Khyber with the careful, irritating caution that keeps armies from starving. A pass is not only a physical gap in rock. It is a schedule, a calendar of when snow melts and when it returns. To move through it, you must count backward from hunger. The quartermasters of Babur's host did arithmetic that seems dull until you realize it is the arithmetic of life. How many camels for the flour? How much flour for the men? How much fodder for the camels? And how many days until the next patch of grass? At the bottom of this chain of calculations was a soldier with a wooden bowl and a thicker-than-water stew. A man who tied his horse with a fetter rope and fed it handfuls of chopped straw, who oiled his match cord against damp. You might think the introduction of gunpowder made war modern here, but first it made it slow. Matches had to stay lit. Powder had to stay dry. Guns and carts had to be lashed together in lines, forming corridors and cul-de-sacs where cavalry could turn. The new technology was not just thunder. It was the discipline of moving a lot of heavy objects on time. If you picture the plains of Hindustan at the end of the winter of 1525 to 26, you do not need to conjure sweeping vistas. See instead, dew on early wheat, mist over a canal, a farmer bringing a handful of grain to market on the back of a little bullock, while on the road beyond, a column of men passed like a slow-moving village. It brought its own bakers, its own farriers, its own menders of torn leather. Babur arranged it in depth, a moving organism that ate where it slept and slept where it ate. He had learned hard lessons in the West about staying power, and this time he brought not only horse archers, but artisans, gunners, and the apparatus of camp administration that could extend a campaign beyond the first burst of energy. He did not invent these things. He combined them and insisted on them. When he faced Ibrahim Lodi at Panipat, the battle was as much a test of logistics as of courage. Babur's wagons were chained and staked in a long, slightly concave line. Each cart a small wall, each gap a controlled funnel. Behind those barriers, matchlock men worked in sequences that were more like carpentry than like poetry, and the cavalry waited for the moment to fan out in enveloping arcs. The plain of Panipat, worked for centuries, must have been familiar to the farmers who watched this from a safe distance, or from as safe a distance as one could hope for. For them, war was another season, the one where grain prices rose as armies bought everything in sight, where there was a little money to be made and a lot of fear to be swallowed. In the days before the encounter, agents went out from both camps to buy or seize fodder. Someone, somewhere, counted bales of straw, and someone, somewhere, made a note in a ledger. The battle is famous because it changed a dynasty. It is worth your attention here because it shows the quiet supremacy of planning. Those narrow corridors between the carts were not improvised. They were measured by pace and by habit. Gunners rested their barrels on forked stands at a standard height. Signals meant the same thing each time a drum was beat or a flag was lifted. When the elephants came, formidable in mass and in noise, they encountered not merely bullets, but a rhythm of fire that made their own rhythm falter. What looks like a cataclysm from afar is up close. The predictable outcome of doing one ordinary thing after another without skipping steps. After that morning, after the dust settled and the smell of saltpeter faded, Babur entered Delhi and then Agra. These entries, too, had their list of tasks. Coins had to be struck bearing his name to circulate not only money, but legitimacy. Men had to be appointed to offices they could actually handle. It is tempting to imagine palaces and parades, but the early months were occupied by surveyors and scribes. Who owns this field? What canals must be dredged? which headman can be persuaded to keep his people in place under new overlords. Listen to the creak of a wooden press stamping coins. You hear the scratch of a pen across paper as revenue assignments are written out. You watch men with measuring ropes step off plots of land while someone else holds a jar of colored pebbles. To mark the kind of soil, the city did not change all at once. Markets remained markets. The same sweetmeat sellers took up the same corners, and the same sweating porters shifted sacks of grain as they had the week before. What changed was the direction in which taxes flowed and the names on the receipts. In Agra, Babur made gardens. You can make too much of that, of course, but you can also make too little. To lay out a garden in the fourfold plan requires more than taste. It requires knowledge of gradients and gravity, of where the water will go and where it will stand. He liked order, and the sharbug was a way to impose it gently on a land that might or might not have asked for it. Digging channels, setting stone edges, planting saplings that will not shade anyone for years, these are the jobs of a ruler. Who expects to stay? The people who did the work did not think of themselves as participating in the birth of an empire. They thought of wages. Water carriers sloshed up and down the channels with goatskin bags. Stone cutters shaped coping stones. Someone set a bench in a patch of shade, and someone else brought a pot of sugared curds. In the afternoon, a man with a piece of charcoal marked the schedule for letting water through the sluices' bed today. That bed tomorrow, because plants, like soldiers, must be put on a ration. A grass warehouses filled with more grain than the court could eat. That meant surplus, and surplus meant options. It meant the ability to pay men on time, another kind of weapon. In the months after Panipat, Babur's letters show a man concerned, not only with enemies, but with arrears. A soldier who is not paid for 2 months can be persuaded to wait if he has confidence in the 3rd month. That confidence is built out of mundane acts: the punctuality of a clerk, the honesty of a cashier, the steadiness of a bridge. Bridges are underrated in histories of conquest, but if you are awake to the boring side of glory, you will notice them. To send an army, you need roads. To make roads useful, you need bridges. And to keep bridges standing, you need carpenters. The Yamuna at Agra could be crossed by boat, but a pontoon bridge planks over anchored boats made the crossing a matter of hours instead of days. Each plank was some artisan's work, planed smooth and drilled at the corners. Each rope was spun by hands that would never be recorded. Across those planks went the business of rule: carts, letters, officers on palfreys, little boys carrying messages. The new regime had to define itself not only upward toward heaven, but downward toward the village. Who adjudicates a boundary dispute? Between 2 cultivators. Under the old sultans, there had been cadis and officials to hear the matter. Under Babur, you can imagine the same shaded courtyard, the same clay cups of water, the same men waiting their turns while a scribe traced lines on a wax tablet. He would not have sought to overturn such routines. He needed them. Conquest is expensive, and change is even more expensive. It is striking how much of Babur's first year in Hindustan can be told through the records of men sitting at tables, a chief accountant calculating land, revenue based on crop type and water access, a military paymaster calculating the difference between the household stipend owed to a cavalryman and the fodder allowance for his horses, a city official noting that repairs to the market canopy would need to wait until after the monsoon, when timber laborers could be spared. The empire came into being not in a single proclamation, but in these measured decisions. The dull and necessary acceptance that governance is mostly maintenance. Yet nothing was entirely settled. To the west and south, power gathered in Rajputana, and Babur's first victory needed to be turned into a coherent claim. The oath he had taken to give up wine in return for victory was not only a private discipline, it was a visible marker that gave moral direction to a coalition. In the countryside, you can imagine farmers gossiping. The new lord forbids wine. What else will he forbid? Rumor is an administrative factor too. It is managed with gestures of public audience where a petition is granted, a remission of taxes. In a flood-stricken district, a commander punished for taking bribes on with a steady repetition of coin and receipt. The grain flows in, the silver flows out. The soldiers are paid, the fields are sown. In this cycle, you hear the hum of an empire trying to start. The hum is not loud. It is made of the most unheroic sounds. Ink drying, water dripping through. Sluice gates, the scuff of sandals on dusty thresholds. You might ask what it felt like to be an ordinary person under these changes. To answer, you lower your point of view until you're standing by a well in a village outside Agra in the early monsoon. A woman draws water with a rope that has been mended twice. Her hands have hard, shiny patches where the rope has rubbed. A man counts seed, pours it into a cloth bag, and ties the top with a knot that he learned from his father. Across the field, strangers have come to measure. They carry bamboo poles and knotted cords. They talk of bighas and yuds and water rights. The man looks up, nods, and goes back to his seed. His world is not changed by words like empire. It is changed by schedules. Will the tax collector arrive before the harvest? Will the market be open after the rains? Will the new men keep the old rates? What looks, from a distance, like the grand sweep of history is here the cautious hope that the mud wall will hold when the river rises, and that the man with the receipt book will accept less today because the flood has taken the lower field. Agra's warehouses filled with more grain than the court could eat. That meant surplus, and surplus meant options. It meant the ability to pay men on time, another kind of weapon. In the months after Panipat, Babur's letters show a man concerned, not only with enemies, but with arrears. A soldier who is not paid for 2 months can be persuaded to wait if he has confidence in the 3rd month. That confidence is built out of mundane acts. The punctuality of a clerk, the honesty of a cashier, the steadiness of a bridge. Bridges are underrated in histories of conquest, but if you are awake to the boring side of glory, you will notice them. To send an army, you need roads. To make roads useful, you need bridges. And to keep bridges standing, you need carpenters. The Yamuna at Agra could be crossed by boat, but a pontoon bridge planks over-anchored boats made the crossing a matter of hours instead of days. Each plank was some artisan's work, planed smooth and drilled at the corners. Each rope was spun by hands that would never be recorded. Across those planks went the business of rule. Carts, letters, officers on palfreys, little boys carrying messages. The new regime had to define itself not only upward toward heaven, but downward toward the village. Who adjudicates a boundary dispute? Between 2 cultivators. Under the old sultans, there had been cadis and officials to hear the matter. Under Babur, you can imagine the same shaded courtyard, the same clay cups of water, the same men waiting their turns while a scribe traced lines on a wax tablet. He would not have sought to overturn such routines. He needed them. Conquest is expensive, and change is even more expensive. It is striking how much of Babur's first year in Hindustan can be told through the records of men sitting at tables, a chief accountant calculating land, revenue based on crop type and water access, a military paymaster calculating the difference between the household stipend owed to a cavalryman and the fodder allowance for his horses, a city official noting that repairs to the market canopy would need to wait until after the monsoon, when timber laborers could be spared. The empire came into being not in a single proclamation, but in these measured decisions. The dull and necessary acceptance that governance is mostly maintenance. Yet nothing was entirely settled. To the west and south, power gathered in Rajputana, and Babur's first victory needed to be turned into a coherent claim. The oath he had taken to give up wine in return for victory was not only a private discipline, It was a visible marker that gave moral direction to a coalition. In the countryside, you can imagine farmers gossiping. The new lord forbids wine. What else will he forbid? Rumor is an administrative factor too. It is managed with gestures of public audience where a petition is granted, a remission of taxes. In a flood-stricken district, a commander punished for taking bribes on with a steady repetition of coin and receipt. The grain flows in, the silver flows out. The soldiers are paid, the fields are sown. In this cycle, you hear the hum of an empire trying to start. The hum is not loud. It is made of the most unheroic sounds. Ink drying, water dripping through. Sluice gates, the scuff of sandals on dusty thresholds. You might ask what it felt like to be an ordinary person under these changes. To answer, you lower your point of view until you're standing by a well in a village outside Agra in the early monsoon. A woman draws water with a rope that has been mended twice. Her hands have hard, shiny patches where the rope has rubbed. A man counts seed, pours it into a cloth bag, and ties the top with a knot that he learned from his father. Across the field, strangers have come to measure. They carry bamboo poles and knotted cords. They talk of bighas and yuds and water rights. The man looks up, nods, and goes back to his seed. His world is not changed by words like empire. It is changed by schedules. Will the tax collector arrive before the harvest? Will the market be open after the rains? Will the new men keep the old rates? What looks, from a distance, like the grand sweep of history is here the cautious hope that the mud wall will hold when the river rises, and that the man with the receipt book will accept less today because the flood has taken the lower field. Across the dry hills, Rajputana gathers itself. You imagine chieftains tightening knots on turbans, adjusting arm guards, checking the fit of lamellar cuirasses that smell faintly of oil and smoke. Their levies come in under banners that tell stories in color and emblem. Their bards know the weight of words and the beat of a drum. They know how to wake the sleeping courage inside a man with a phrase. Their cavalry is not the same as the step-born horsemen of Babur's line, but they are no less skilled. They sit square in the saddle, reins in one hand, lance or sword in the other, shield ready to tilt. If you listen to the Rajput camp from a distance, you would hear the high ring of steel on stone as a blade is freshened, the murmured exchange of news about who has joined and who has held back. Their world is made of fealty and feud, of land grants that tie a man to a village and a village to a fort. Between those forts lies the work of peasants who will step aside to let an army pass and look back at their fields with the unworried worry of people who have seen this before. When you come to the plain of Kanwa, you do not see a stage set. For destiny, you see ground chosen for its utility. Babur's men look for the gentle undulations that will shelter a trench, the shallow bank where wagons can be chained and trussed, the slight rise that gives a field of fire to matchlocks. The line hardens through labor. Men drive stakes. Carts are aligned. Ropes are tightened. Gaps are measured out by strides and memory. Behind those lines, musketeers check again the length of their match cords and the angle of their forked rests. Between the wagons, the cavalry wait, their horses cropping dry tufts of grass with the unhurried insistence of animals that must eat when there is something to eat. The old step tactic of enveloping wings will be used in a new way here. Not as free-roaming swarms, but as deliberately released arcs that spring from a fixed, smoking hinge. That hinge is the wagon line, and its virtue is not glory, but stubbornness. On the far side, the Rajput array is visible like a living textile spread on the earth. Elephants stand forward under canopies, their foreheads painted, their tusks blunted with iron bells and caps. They bring weight and height, and a kind of moving enclosure, a wooden tower, from which a warrior can look down on men and swing a blade in a wide circle. Around them, Infantry carry bows, matchlocks purchased from coastal traders, spears, and swords that their fathers and grandfathers carried. The Rajput captains trust in shock and in the courage of men who ride toward the sound of their own songs. Their camp followers are as numerous as the fighting men, because war in this land is also a procession. Cooks, armorers, grooms, water sellers, women bearing bundles with mortar and pestle, boys carrying towels and sandals. The battle day is a working day for all of them. The limit of a man's bravery is sometimes the limit of the system behind him. Powder runs out. Water runs low. The line you stand in becomes a crowd when order frays. Babur's vow is spoken again in the hearing of his captains, not to announce an ethic, but to fix a structure. The absence of drink in a camp becomes a way of measuring seriousness, of setting a norm that makes men swallow their fear without a numbing swallow to make it easier. You can see, in the tent where planning is done, the replaced cups a bowl of sugared water, a plate of melon, a book of verse open to a page that speaks not of indulgence but of memory and restraint. It is easy to overread such moments, but you know enough of human habit to sense the difference they make. A camp that watches itself can hold its shape in midday heat and acrid smoke. For soldiers, sobriety is also schedule. The evening inspection of cords and flints, the morning checking of girths, the midday ration of water measured out by ladle into bowls. No more and no less. When drums beat, men know not only what it means, but when it should sound in the arc of a day. This is how you weather the arrival of something loud and heavy and frightening, by doing the next thing you have done 100 times. The noise at Kanwa is unremarkable in one sense because it is what all gunpowder battles sound like, a mix of percussion and breath and hooves and human voice. It is remarkable in another sense because of the patterns it announces. A line of smoke puffs at regular intervals along the wagons, like a cooking line at a festival. Except that this food is metal stroking air at ruinous speed. Between the lines, there is a space made of dust and shouted orders into which cavalry move and then move out again, like the tide pulling through a narrow gap. Elephants come forward and find themselves jostled by a rhythm of shots and a geometry of trenches that forces them to see obstacles where none should be. Some turn. When they turn, their weight disturbs the lines behind. Some press on and are met by braced spears at waist height, by fire delivered so close that men taste saltpeter on their tongues. Through it all, water carriers weave, dribbling as little as possible, cursing the jostling each trip downtown and back, another small victory against the shortening of breath. If you stand with a single musketeer for a moment, you will understand survival as a series of small negotiations. He dips for powder without spilling. He taps the barrel to settle the grains. He keeps his match from burning down too far or blowing out entirely. He breathes with the shot so that his hand does not jump. He steps back to let the next man step forward. He feels the pressure in his chest and the dryness in his mouth. Hears the drum signals and waits for the intervals they promise. Across that space, a Rajput swordsman measures his own steps, adjusting the tilt of his shield to catch splinters, following the serviceable shade of an elephant's flank, hoping to break the line into pieces big enough to conquer with courage. Between these men, the ground itself does work, preserving the trenches, supporting the lacings of the carts that keep a corridor narrow, catching spent, shot, and errant hoof. Tactic is a habit and a plan, but it is also soil and rope, stake and not bad air and the pain in a knee. When the line holds at midday, the difference is made at dozens of small points. A boy sent to fetch more match cord finds the man who keeps the coils exactly where he should be and returns without losing his way. A cavalry captain on the right wing makes his turn one moment later than instinct prefers and thereby avoids the trap of an elephant that would have crushed his foremost riders. A runner with a message finds the tent of a subaltern who has moved and does not waste 5 minutes searching for a flag that, not in the confusion, fell at the wrong angle. The Rajput momentum breaks on that web of correctly timed ordinaries. The moment of turning is not theatrical. It is weary. It is the kind of relief you feel when the last pot has been washed after a long day of feeding too many guests. Not triumph. Exactly, but a loosening in the shoulders and a renewed appetite for the steady tasks that will now follow. After Kanwa, the landscape of power changes like a river changing channel after flood. It leaves the old bed with water standing here and there in eddies and pools, not entirely empty, not entirely filled. Babur moves to Chanderi, where another power center waits. A smaller one, but stubborn Medin Rai and his men. A different cluster of loyalties. Siege is a slower kind of danger. It eats men with boredom and with dysentery more often than with blades. You pay attention here to the latrines, to the regulations that forbid fouling the upstream side of the camp, to the scheduled removal of waste to pits downwind. You hear the tent masters remind men to wash with a little of the precious water, to rub sand on hands if there is no water to spare. The discipline of sanitation is unromantic and unforgiving. Armies that ignore it are thinned without glory. Armies that attend to it survive to make noise at the gate with ladders and hooks. When the day comes, the siege also turns you toward wood and metal in a new way. Ladders must be made to length, their rungs fixed not too close for heavy armor to climb, and not too far for short legs. Hooks must be forged by men who know how to judge the walls, coping stones by sight and by tapping. The assault day is a craft day, and failure is measured by a splintered rung and a fall. Inside the fort, defenders count arrows and ration courage. They watch the stocks of ghee and grain shrink. They send messages out to allies tied to the fort by marriage and favor. You can imagine, too, the bargaining that happens in the shadow. A finality: if we open the gate, who will be spared? If we do not, what will be lost anyway? The resolution at Chanderi is a stark one. But even stark choices are delivered by practical means: gate swung, men placed, terms set. And afterward, a tally of weapons and provisions taken, of captives counted and assigned. While strong points yield or persist, the countryside must be walked back into work. Garrisons are set, and garrisons are paid. The people who sell to garrisons, the grocers and grain, brokers of market towns, need coins that mean the same thing week to week. Mints hum again, a sound like a slow bell repeated endlessly, and new names circulate with old weights. A local headman receives a new seal to press on a document that looks like the old one to the eye, but names another master to the legal ear. The tax rate is asserted with the everyday sternness a collector must perform to get his due without turning the village into a place of flight. When rates are remitted, the record is kept. When rates are demanded in full, the record is kept. The empire grows on paper and wood, in seals and strings, in sacks tied closed with a knot that a child could recognize and an adult could not open without cutting. It is dull, and it is everything. The last resistance in the northeast among Afghan chiefs aligned with the old sultans and with powers of the delta draws Babur toward rivers. The confluence is a kind of fort made of water, where boats are bridges and bridges are made of boats. You can see the preparation again. Boatmen are hired, ropes are twisted, planks are planned. Poles are shaped with iron tips for pushing. Men learn the river like they learn the pass, by counting, by watching, by waiting for the right hour. Schools of fish mark a current. A log turning slowly tells a story about eddies. A floating leaf maps a safe crossing with the laziness of a lazy mind. The clash that follows is less famous than Panipet or Kanwa. But for you it is instructive because it shows the same pattern. The application of practiced, small things to a situation that looks new and is not. Across the run of water, on fields that will soon be green again. A recognizable order is asserted with little flags and long lists. When the dust of these months settles, the map looks different and the diet of a soldier looks the same. Wheat, or millet ghee if he is lucky, lentils, a sour milk to cut the heat, a handful of dried fruit if a caravan has come near. The horse eats chopped straw with a little barley if there is barley to spare, and he drinks before the man does because the horse's thirst is a more fragile problem. The rules hold because they are rules. A system that relies on extraordinary people is a system that fails on ordinary days. Babur's gift, as you see it now, is the insistence on ordinary competence in extraordinary situations. He sweeps aside courage that arrives without preparation. He refuses comfort that weakens the edge of habit. He repeats himself in orders and expects men to be saved by the repetition. The grand bolts of conquest are driven by small threads turned always in the same direction, always to the same tension. You might say then, that the victory over the Rajput coalition and the piecemeal quieting of Afghan resistance are both political facts and procedural triumphs. The politics collect into a story of precedence and of who speaks first in the court. The procedures collect into a manual of survival that any soldier, clerk, or farmer would recognize, even if he did not care about who sat under which canopy on which day. At the end of this long, slow turning of events, the empire is less an R. An R is less than an R. A procedures collect an R or an R to a manual of subbisters, play, a point flag, where my place. You will leave her dealt. A play to see with a we of wav, my may mide. My why of way of said, my may. I do see out, my risk. It's a gravit. I see it to we see it to kakazai to seg play of I to kakata sa it. A sequid to sag I leaks. Dixit to plat lie I buy to guz it said it to be up back a piece is agree to tad and up to do to the west make it to tad spot best it's event than a way of doing things. You leave the camp at night and hear the same sounds that began your day. A horse sighing through its nose, a pot lid settling as it cools, a sentry rubbing his eyes because the lamp smoke makes them sting. You are left with a practical uncertainty that is the only uncertainty that matters in the long term. Now that the habit of order has proved itself in upheaval, can it prove itself in peace when tedium tempts slackness and prosperity invites forgetfulness, or will the apparatus that held under strain unwind when there is nothing left to fear but the dullness of routine? Peace is not a condition so much as a schedule to be kept. When the campaigns ease, you walk the same road from Agra to the river and see the wheels of governance turn at a slower, more audible rate. The mint strikes coins with names that make sense to the scribes, but to the sellers of grain, the weight and ring are what matter. A set of weights lies on a grocer's counter, a nest of brass pieces like a family of sleeping turtles, and a scale pans above them with a dusting of flour, where it has touched measure after measure. Out in the Doab, the land between the rivers where fertility is an equation of water and will, men with ropes and poles still measure fields, and scribes still write down the numbers and shake sand over the wet ink. The difference now is that the men who come to collect are expected, and when they leave, a slip of paper with a smear of seal wax and a thumbprint stays behind. That scrap proves nothing grand. It proves that the system remembers. And a system that remembers is harder to cheat and easier to please. The assignation of jagirs, revenue circles to support men who have supported the state, is a negotiation between ambition and arithmetic. Each captain wants a district that yields steadily and is close to his household, but not all districts are plums. Some are stringy, less fertile, farther away. A clerk lays out possibilities with a pen in a margin, drawing little squares and circles that stand for villages and markets. And a man's face shifts as he calculates what each symbol means in coin and in control. The principle is simple, but the practice is a thicket. If an assignee squeezes too hard, men flee or fields go to weeds. If he squeezes too little, the Central Treasury wonders why a service officer's band of Horus grows larger while the state's own resources do not. To manage this, the court insists on musters. Horses are paraded and examined, teeth checked, fetlocks rubbed, brands compared against records. A clean horse belly and a clear eye are as much an administrative concern as district yields. In this, prosaic attention to animal health, you can feel the reach of the state into the muscles that power its assertions. Agra begins to perform its capitalness in daily ways. The road surfaces near the market are dampened in the mornings to settle dust. A team of watermen splash and sweep before the first shops open shutters. The lanes that pass through artisans' quarters sound different at different hours. The rasp of stone at the knife sharpeners, steady and dry. The percussive ring of a coppersmith's hammer in a pattern as precise as a prayer. The low hum from a cloth merchant's stall as men thumb the nap of new-dyed wool and argue about price. Gardens rise along the riverbank, fourfold shapes kept, intact by stone lips that steer water. You watch the watermaster walk with a stick and point to a boy to open a little gate. The stream runs this way today and that way tomorrow, making relief maps of the ruler's mind in the soil itself. The garden is not only shade and fruit, 'tis governance expressed in irrigation, excess energy converted into a pattern that must be maintained. Letters go out and letters come in. Babur's voice on paper is the voice of a man who remembers the texture of other places Samarkand. For Ghana, the taste of melons he will compare forever and who watches the present for its softness and its threat. He writes like a man who distrusts the ease that success brings. You overhear a court reader, his finger under a line, tracing words that warn against waste and against cruelty. Admonitions not overturned by the smile of a handsome favorite or the joke of a well-born wit. The court settles into its own particular blend of severity and indulgence. Gardens and poems, yes. Brocade and bright paint on pavilion walls, yes. But also the plain lists of a regime that has learned the price of distraction. The treasury books are checked against coin chests with a repetition that bores the impatient and comforts those who understand decency as punctuality to the east. River campaigns have left memory and structure. The boat bridges that were thrown across 4 armies remain useful for commerce. Ferrymen who learn to lash rafts into stability teach others the same knots. The Delta kingdoms watch from beyond with their own calculations, and border towns adjust their ledgers accordingly, adding a column for the new tariff and its exemptions. You stand in a narrow room with a ceiling too low for comfort and breathe air heavy with ink as a broker counts the mentions of a certain spice on bills of lading to predict next month's price. The empire is not a wall that keeps things out. It is a habit of passage that makes more things come through. A police constable stops a gang of men along the road and asks for a toll receipt. The men produce a scrap with the right squeeze of a seal. He lets them pass. The difference between commerce and predation is, sometimes, the ability to produce a paper on demand. Humility arrives as an administrative virtue, too. The men who watch Babur fight learn to say, "I do not know," and to ask someone who does. A city official in charge of drains visits a mason to learn how to pitch a walkway so that monsoon water does not pool in a corner where a vendor would slip. A cavalry officer asks a farrier why a certain saddle rubs a certain way and then writes down the answer because he knows he will forget it otherwise. These small submissions to expertise do not make a romantic story, but they make for fewer disasters. In a place where climate is bossy intense heat, intense rain. Long dry months you serve the elements by trying to predict them. When an early storm brings down 20 tents, a clerk notes which ropes frayed and recommends a different fiber for next season's purchase. Thus does a court resolve to buy a different rope. Thus is the state improved by boredom. At the center of all this, Bobber grows older by the clock, which ticks with a speed anyone who has worked too hard recognizes. He is a man shaped by movement who now is asked to sit and preside. He walks in the gardens as much for the shade as for the order. They promise, and when he writes lines of verse, you can hear a pulse that runs beneath them, a longing for places whose air is thinner, whose melons are sweeter because winter there is real, and an acceptance that his bones will not go back to those places as they once were. He signs orders with the same hand that wrote poems, and perhaps the ink does not feel different from one use to the other. He is surrounded by men who have depended on his focus in battle, and who now depend on his focus in apportioning offices. Focus in either case is measured in weariness. Even his renunciation of wine takes on a different aspect now. Not a battle vow, but a sustained climate that keeps the edges of his attention sharp. When the day repeats itself, he meets death with less spectacle than you might expect from the founding figure of a dynasty. The matter is handled in the way that matters are always handled by men who respect process. The right people are told. The right objects are placed on the right tables. The right seals are kept under the right eyes. The story of his body, first buried where he died, then later moved by his son back to the city where his memory learned to breathe again, is the story of continuities crossing countries. What is important for you to notice is the work this demands of other people. A funeral is labor. A reburial is labor multiplied. Men haul and lift and chant. Women cook and weep and hold children out of the way. Horses stand tethered in a line with their ears flicking at flies. The founder is honored with the solidity of food and stone and the repetition of phrases that do not change because they do not need to in the gaps around grief. Urgent items fill in automatically. Succession is partly a matter of sentiment and largely a matter of posted lists. The men who hold assignments need to know whether they hold them still. The Treasury needs to know whether to issue coin under a new name. The men who patrol the roads need to know whether to seize the property of any officer who went too far in private acquisition under the old name. It is delicate and it is dull. In those days of change, the empire proves itself by not breaking. You listen for rioting and hear inspections. You look for fires and see kitchens. You look at bridges and see carts going over them in the same old way. Which is to say, the only way that matters for the lives of those who cross. Bobber's legacy is a toolbox of habits. He leaves engine scarts, chained and staked, trenches dug, musketeers drilled, cavalry trained to hinge around a point, and he leaves manuals unwritten but obvious. Pay on time. Keep horses sound. Dig latrines downstream. Put your wagons where they can be turned into a fence. Measure before you promise. Water the garden on schedule. Walk the market early. Reward men for work done and not work described. Remember that. Rumor is a tax that can be raised or lowered by action. His heirs will fumble some of these, and an adversary, precise and austere in his own way, will improve upon others. What makes the Mughal enterprise endure beyond a generation is less genius than conscientiousness. The genius was an accelerant. Conscientiousness is a fuel. You stand as this first story closes at the edge of a field where the shoots have just come up. A boy chases birds between rows with a string tied to tins that clatter. In the distance, an officer rides the boundary of the district he is assigned, counting groves, noting broken buns that need shoring. He will send a note to the office in the town, and someone there will tally it against other notes, and someone else will send men with baskets and spades. The grand names will not be spoken at the well where the workers drink. The workers will sip and wipe their mouths with the backs of their hands and return to the boring task that keeps the line straight and the water in place. You are left with a question that sits quietly in the evening air. If empire is, at bottom, the repetition of careful acts, what happens when fear recedes and vanity advances? Who will keep counting? And who will keep the ropes tight? And who will remember where to place the first stake when the next fence must be built? You step back into the heat of Delhi and Agra, where governance is a daily chore and victory has the frailness of a spring blossom on a dusty road. The founder's work has just settled into a rhythm when a younger man, his son, must learn how to keep that rhythm from falling apart. You hear Human's name spoken with respect and worry in the markets and guardrooms. For respect flows down from lineage, and worry rises up from the knowledge that the earth is not yet steady under new feet. He inherits soldiers who expect, rewards captains who hear their own names when they think of the word loyalty, and revenue streams that have only begun to remember which way to flow. The ledger of the realm shows neat columns and smears where the ink has bled in the monsoon, and a young emperor needs to harden those lines into habits before they wash away from the first days. His world is populated by the ordinary figures who decide whether a dynasty survives, coiners who test the alloy by the pitch of a ring, headmen who open the granary with 2 keys at once so no one can be accused of stealing when the stores are low, scribes who read last year's records. And guess how much of this year's floodwater will leave silt and how much will leave ruin. Human's court is an inheritance and a workshop. Men bind petitions with string and stamp them with seals that still smell faintly of wax and oil. The army, which is also a moving city, requires the same drudgery his fathers did. Saddles checked, mules fed, match cord dried in the morning sun, flints tested by a small, reversible spark. The difference lies in the firmness of the hand that directs all this. The founder's will was a blade. The heir's will must be a whetstone, slowly maintaining the edge through repetition. In the countryside, the memory of Babur's victories is already an echo, and other voices grow louder. Afghan chieftains, familiar with the fields and forts of Hindustan, hearing the tone of a new court and recognizing indecision as an opportunity, pull together their bands around men who know both the land and the art of turning a tax road into an ambush. Among them rises a figure who will not leave the paperwork of empire unchanged. Farid, later called Sher Khan, and then Sher Shah. A man who learned to survive not by clutching glory, but by understanding the mechanics of dues and the leverage of roads. In smaller courts, he learned how to make a headman listen, how to make a market master count in his favor, how to balance the expectations of an Afghan clan with the realities of the rations that feed them. He was practical before he was powerful. Human faces him first, not in the vocabulary of empire, but in the sentence structure of terrain and timing. The battles that begin this duet are not decided by a single shout, but by the aggregate of small delays. A courier who cannot find the tent he seeks at dusk because the lamps have been set in a confusing line. A captain who keeps his men by the cooking pot 5 minutes too long because the stew is not thick enough to carry them to noon. A company of matchlock men whose powder takes longer to be issued because a mule turned its ankle in a rut on the road 2 days ago. There are also the unnoticed privileges of proximity. A young emperor's friends, not always his most efficient officers, are close to the place where decisions are made. Courtiers who know how to smile at the right time earn authority that exceeds their competence. From small misalignments, larger sways develop in the line of march. You stand with Human's men near Chosa, and later near Kanajuj, not at the moment when banners meet, but in the hours when 1,000 tiny choices decide whether men will be in the right place with the right tools. The soldiers do not feel like a machine. They feel like a crowd. This is not a failure of courage. 'Tis a failure of upholstery, the unseen structure that keeps cushions in place so the carriage rides smoothly. Shere Khan's talent is recognizing an empire not as an edifice, but as a set of recurring errands. He listens for the place where an errand will be missed. His men move along lanes where toll collectors know his name and are told to look the other way so that a convoy passes at dawn rather than waiting to pay at noon. He buys grass in the villages before Human's quartermasters do. And what begins as a small advantage, the better bundles of fodder becomes a larger one when horses march better and arrive with bellies less hollow. By the river at Chosa, the air is thick and warm, as river air often is, and your attention is pulled not just by the armies, but by the boats. The boats that must be there in the right number, moored in the right way to serve as a bridge when the water's mood turns. The river does not care about genealogies. It cares about anchors and knots and the judgment of men who watch its color. Shere Khan's judgment is exact. He chooses a moment when the world of paper slips, when the command chain is unsure, when the emperor's camp is arranged in a way that hides signals from key captains, when the monsoon's shoulder presses the river into a more dangerous shape. The fighting is fierce where men meet, yes, but the decisions have been made by the preparation and placement of ordinary things: boats, ladders, bundles of straw, hand tools, granaries, opened or kept locked, scouts told to ride or told to rest. Defeat is a word that seems to belong in capitals, but it happens in sentences and fractions. At Kannauj, when Humayun tries to gather himself and the house of Timur behind him, the supplies that would have stabilized a shaky plan are not where they should be. The roads Shere Khan has organized dump energy into his reservoirs, and men, who might have held if they had been fed well and slept well, stumble forward, brave and unsteady. An army's heart breaks not only when a leader falters, but when the line breaks under the weight of its own disrepair. The aftermath is a list: horses lost, carts abandoned, men counted and then missing, officers who do or do not report in time. The ledger of the empire's middle months turns from black to red. The parts of the administration that make succession possible do their best to keep order. Stamps are moved, seals are guarded, coin dies are buried or spirited away, records are packed into chests and loaded onto carts. In defeat, the path forward often runs through the rooms of strangers. For Humayun, it runs toward Persia. If you follow him not in the front-page headlines of kings, but in the back rooms of scribes, you notice that the exile is also a reordering of paperwork. Letters go ahead of him, testifying to the worth of a guest who needs favor. Caravans adjust to carry his household from one lodging to another. Border officials write notes to each other to keep the passage smooth. Cordial words are traded for very practical favors: protection, supplies, introductions. In the halls of the Safavid court, young man who seemed too soft at home learns a different kind of hardness, one that is almost gentle. He watches how a different empire files its days, how ministers speak to monarchs, how coins are struck with faces and phrases that carry theology as well as authority. He sees what he must become if he returns not a hero, but a manager of expectations and a curator of habits. Back in Hindustan, Sher Shah has not yet become Sher Shah. He is busy doing the thankless work that turns victory into order. He does not write poetry as his rival's father did. He writes policies which are rarely beautiful and always binding. He composes in the language of roads. The Grand Trunk Road is, at its grandest, a long idea that a long, straight stretch of packed earth and stone can make the spaces of the realm slide closer to each other. But if you stand on it tomorrow morning and watch, you see a quieter dream. Realized, the mile marker placed just so. The shade trees planted at intervals that match a man's need to rest. The sarai, every few ko's where a traveler can find water, fodder, a charpoy, a hearth, and a stable. The small bell hung for summoning the keeper. The road is maintained by men who scrape and tamp and mend, who pack stone into washouts, who trim trees. They are paid by officials who have lists that must be signed and countersigned. This is how security feels, like the predictable availability of a bowl of lentils at dusk. He also composes in the language of money. When coinage confuses, commerce suffers and tax farmers thrive. Sher Shah reorganizes the weights and measures, regularizes the silver coin, the rupiah, copper, the diamond, tells marketmen to count with confidence. You see a buyer rub a new coin against his tooth, feel its bite, listen for its ring, and then put it in his pouch, knowing it will buy the same amount tomorrow. He posts schedules of prices and reprimands those who would stretch them in times of shortage. He puts police on roads to challenge men who carry goods without papers and posts at sarais to log travelers so that robbery becomes riskier and reputation easier to track. In market towns, a new kind of quiet spreads, the quiet of fairness enforced. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but predictably enough that merchants write letters home describing not just profits, but routines. Agriculture is the meaning of empire in a land where most people are farmers, so his composition includes fields. He orders measurements, not one grand survey on a single glorious day, but many careful steps by men with knotted ropes and bamboo poles. The pata, a paper that states a cultivator's rights and dues, is matched by a cabuliat, a promise back. The point is to reduce the space where arbitrariness can grow. The zemindar, the local intermediary who makes the state real or unbearable, is kept in place but watched. The adjustments happen at the pace of plow oxen, not at the pace of drums. The men in charge carry rods for measuring and thick books. For recording, their sandals get dusty, their shoulders burn. They drink water from clay cups with wet rims and sit in the shade with a stick to draw lines in dirt that stand for lines on paper that stand for lines in men's minds. The sense of security becomes, for a cultivator, an expectation that next season will resemble this one in its demands. You can hear a new postal rhythm, too. Runners carry packets between sarais in relays. A man's legs, now a part of the state. In a literal way, a message that would have taken days moves in hours because a fresh runner waits at the next station. The runners do not sing of glory. They sing to keep their breathing regular. Their pay is small and given regularly. They are watched not just for robbery, but for tardiness. For tardiness in a message can be as deadly as theft. When a district officer needs a decision, he can expect one by the next market day, and this expectation civilizes his behavior. He must still decide much on his own, but he is not alone. And when he writes to explain a remission of tax because of flood, he receives an answer that uses the same words and shares the same assumptions. Sher Shah stands up a system of justice that looks ordinary to those who use it because that is the point. He names men to hear cases disputes over boundaries, over debts, over injuries, and those men sit under pavilions while plaintiffs and defendants speak in turn. The procedures are not magical. They are formalities in the best sense, guarding against a judge's mood and the Lord's pressure. Receipt books are held like talismans. Men learn the art of speaking in the terms the court recognizes. This exposure to rules, repeated in district after district, is a social education that plays. As a social education that plays, I see Khalid decays, and leaves a rich, long-lasting color. Men learn the art of speak, men learn. Men learn them of seas, men learn. Plays, my lies, my lie, where I leave. Plays our lies, with seeds, with decide. Cup, it is kanda, to be supid. Light outlives the ruler who promoted it. The people become citizens in the only useful sense. They learn the rules that protect them from random harm and the limits of those protections. Human, hearing of these changes from the safe distance of exile, learns to lessons. He learns that legitimacy that rides out at dawn must return at dusk carrying bread. He learns that the best answer to a rival who builds reliable roads is not a poem, but a better road. In the bazaars of a foreign city, he watches merchants counting coins that match, watches lines of men lining up for pay that arrives on time, watches the same man with the same baton count horses for a master who checks the count. He takes notes, perhaps literally, perhaps in his habits. And exile remembers. When a man like this returns, the return is not a trumpet blast. It is a rustle of papers and a shifting of burdens. A path must be cleared through Kandahar and Kabul by patient sieges and bargains, because a seat in Hindustan requires a platform. In the north, alliances are made with words and with marriages, and carts move again because they always move before an army. Coin dies are sought out and cleaned. Seal rings are found and pressed again. Bairam Khan, a soldier and a disciplinarian, appears beside him like a metronome, keeping time while the music resumes. The resurrection of a dynasty is a series of timely arrivals: food, horseshoes, written orders, men with the right experience, in the right posts. To rebuild is to return to the dullness that saved you and to convince others to accept it as the price of safety. You count time now by roads and by coin issues, by toll receipts and by court dockets, and you begin to see what the real contest between Humayun and Sher Shah has become. It is not a dispute over who wears paper crowns on festival days, but a competition over which system of daily procedures can survive the sudden shock and the long drag. In your ear, the ordinary noises of an effective state grow louder. The chisel against a coin die, the chant of surveyors moving across a field, the morning shout to open a sarai gate, the nighttime count of prisoners to prove none has escaped by bribing the guard. You feel a strange calm reading these lists, because they are the only narrative of good government that matters, and now you stand at the edge of this stretch of the story, with the same practical curiosity that has guided you this far. One man has the field, and his policies are working. The other is learning in absence what presence makes possible. The question is not whether one is more heroic or more beloved. The question is whether the habits planted along roads and canals will bear fruit under another hand, or whether the vines of daily corruption will climb whatever trellis is available and strangle the tidy work you have watched rise. When the chairs are moved and the names on the orders change, will the sarai keeper keep the bell polished, the surveyor keep the rope knots honest, and the coins strike true? Or will the next wind loosen everything you have come to rely upon? Begin early at a sarai. The gate is an arch with wooden doors that swing on thickly greased hinges. A boy scrubs the threshold with a straw brush to keep the dust down. Inside, a courtyard opens with low rooms around it and a well sunk at the center. On one side, a low stable runs the length of the wall, filled with the rustling and snorting of animals greeting morning. On the other, a kitchen breathes smoke and cumin. Travelers start to move with the day. A caravan master rolls up his bedding and ties it with a practiced knot. A clerk from a small district office wipes his pen with a rag, checks his letters, and asks for ink. Courier eats quickly, his leg muscles already tensing for the first mile. The sarai keeper notes their names and destinations in a worn book. A record that is both hospitality and surveillance, a map drawn with footsteps. This is one node in a network that Sher Shah has set humming, not for romance, but for predictability. Follow the road as it leaves the sarai, and you'll notice the geometry of convenience. Shade trees are planted in a spacing that answers the human body's need for rest. A man walking with a bundle over his shoulder spies the next patch of shade and calculates whether to stop here or there. The roadbed itself is not a simple track. It is cambered to shed rain, packed with gravel. Where the soil is weak, buttressed where the stream threatens to undercut. The men who keep it so deserve mention because they are the stone beneath the foot. They carry baskets and tools, mending small damage before it becomes big damage. They are paid by the month, their names written in lists. Their foreman counts. Heads, his superior counts foreman. The chain of oversight is dull and necessary. Without it, the road is a rumor that disappears in the first storm. With it, the road becomes a habit that shapes how far a boatman will ship, where a merchant will risk a larger load, how a farmer will choose to carry surplus to market, knowing he can return before the oxen tire. Money makes the road worth traveling. Sher Shah's coinage reform teaches people to trust the small ring of a disc of metal as a reliable measure of trust. He standardizes weight and fineness, not by decree alone, but by enforcement and by making enough coins to replace the mess of mints that confused markets. In a bazaar, a money changer sets out trays of coins on a mat, each tray a different kind. Under Sher Shah, the trays grow fewer. The money changer knows this is not entirely good for his old tricks, but it is better for his trade. He can count faster. He can accept distant coin with less haggling. In the countryside, a cultivator who sells his surplus is paid in coin that the village grocer will take without shaving or weighing it again. The measure of dignity in rural life is often the measure of friction endured. With this new money, some friction is sanded off. Land generates both food and conflict, so the reformer attacks the arithmetic that makes neighbors into antagonists. You see him, not personally, but in the hands and eyes of his surveyors, preoccupied with fairness achievable by measurement. A field is not a dream. It is an area to be stepped off and noted. The biga is the unit of life here, and men argue about bigas with the intensity of men arguing about respect. The pata, that a cultivator holds the paper that says what he owes and what he may expect to keep, is a contract not only with the state but with his own past. If he keeps the same field year over year, he can think of improvement. If the dues are stable, he can risk sowing a crop that takes more care because he will not be robbed of its reward by arbitrary increase. The surveyor's rope becomes a lifeline, counted carefully, adjusted for fairness, and watched by the farmer with a skepticism that melts into trust only when the numbers do not change with the wind. You meet the zamindar again here, the local magnate who stands between the state and the village like a tree that gives shade and sometimes takes light. Sher Shah redefines the angle at which this tree leans. He holds the zamindar to account, makes him answerable for the flow of dues, but he also uses him as the hinge on which collection turns. The zamindar's men still carry sticks and write lists. They still prefer cousins for favorable treatment, and the state cannot end kinship any more than it can end rain. What it can do is insist on records that travel. The zamindar's account must match the district account. The district account must match the provincial account. People begin to understand that the numbers are not only powerful near home, they have strength at a distance. Distance is where exploitation has often hidden. When distance becomes a path rather than a screen, those hiding places grow fewer. Sher Shah reorganizes policing not as a campaign, but as a routine. At road crossings, a small post holds men with staves and a book for recording passersby. Night patrols in towns grow a little more regular. The law is a man with a lantern as much as it is a code. Robbery does not disappear. Thieves adapt. But the price of impunity rises, and the expectation of being caught rises with it. Merchants change their calculations and carry more goods, knowing the odds, and by doing so, they make markets thicker. A thick market is safer for everyone who must sell in order to buy. His justice has a rural face. He identifies places where disputes are too often settled with sticks and knives and sends men to listen and note. The court sits on certain days, and people come to expect it. A judge's habits are as important as his decisions. If he arrives on time and leaves on time, if he hears both sides with a predictable order, people shape their complaints into those orders. Dismissed claims become fewer when people learn what a valid claim looks like. The state's favorite folktale is a man wronged who is righted by a ruler's wise ear. The less dramatic truth is the ruler's insistence that all ears attached. To the state, listen the same way. Everything you've watched, trodes, coins, surveys, posts, courts needs food. Sher Shah's administration pays. It pays the sarai keeper, the road mender, the judge's scribe, the postal runner, the mint worker, the surveyor, the carpenter who repairs the judge's stool, the water carrier who keeps the courthouse well bucket filled. It pays late sometimes because no state is perfect, but it pays often enough to make service seek service. To make a boy with a strong back think he might become a man with a steady wage if he ties his life to the state's errands. This is loyalty of the most valuable kind, the loyalty purchased with reliable wages for boring work. His military policies are less celebrated in song and more beloved by quartermasters. He insists on descriptive roles for soldiers and on musters that verify horses. He imposes branding and descriptive lists that tie a man to a mount and a mount to a pay sheet. Fraud shrinks when the fraudster must impersonate in two directions. At once, he redistributes land assignments to match service obligations and cuts back on slackers who have grown comfortable squeezing villages. These acts make enemies. Any cleanup makes enemies of the men who made dirt. But the settled parts of the countryside feel a kind of gratitude that cannot easily be shouted. It feels like a man who is less afraid to plant. Then, as always, the pressure of time presses. The work of organization and reform is wearing, and bodies tire. Sher Shah does not get to write a long, steady story. His life ends in an accident that belongs to the class of misfortune's generals. Know too well the unpredictable violence of powder and fire. Men carry him, and then men carry him away. The lists on his tables still lie in their piles. The road crews still report in their order. The surveys continue. The sarais open as usual at dawn and close their gates at night. The system keeps breathing for a while without him because it has learned to breathe on its own. That is the test of a reformer. To watch that breathing is to see the soul of a bureaucracy, which is durable only when separated from a single chest. His successors inherit the duty to keep the habit going. Some do passively, some less so. Near the surface of daily life, this variance appears as a drift. The sarai keeper grows a little laxer about his registers. The patrol on the river road misses a night here and there. The judge is slower to appear in the afternoon shade. The money changer's tooth test grows more suspicious again. This is what loss looks like when it is not a collapse but a decay. Tiny failures at the edge of each day. People adapt in both directions. They become more vigilant and more cynical. Their world is not broken, but it creaks. Meanwhile, beyond the careful order he strove to fix, the old claimant returns from the cold rooms of exile with a warmer understanding of how to hold things. Human comes back through the mountains he once fled, touching many of the stations his father once stabilized. He makes alliances less grand and more minimal. He promises that which he can pay for. He sits longer in rooms where papers rustle, and shorter on horseback, because his skill now is less the stroke and more the signature. He can count on administrators who learned under his rival. Because competence learned under one master is competence under another. Even a defeated dynasty may inherit from its defeater the things that matter most, habits that make it possible. To obtain bread, remit taxes in bad years. punish soldiers who steal from farmers, and cause the coin to ring neatly under a tester's finger. The approach to Delhi this time is not a triumphant crash, but an adult's return to the family shop after an apprenticeship away. He moves carts and men into the city, speaks to heads of guilds and men who keep records, assures them that the money will come, and then makes sure it does. Bairam Khan's discipline moves through the revived army like a wooden shuttle through cloth, tying each row to the next, making a fabric that can take weight. On the street, a baker kneads dough and notes that the price of flour is not rising, as it did in the last changeover. At the ford, a ferryman refuses a coin that used to pass, but now does not. And the man who offered it does not argue because he knows the rule will be the same across the river. These are the signs of order people trust, unremarkable refusals and routine acceptances. Shared by strangers, the blueprint you have watched emerge over these years tells you something practical and not very flattering. About power, it matters. Who draws the plan less than whether the plan is drawn in pencil or in ink that runs when it rains. The better plan is the plan that can be read the next day with the same eyes. Sher Shah wrote parts of the empire in ink that dried hard. Humayun learned to hold that paper steady and to avoid spilling water on it. Out of this cold observation grows a warm hope, especially if you live in a village cut by a long road and blessed by a nearby sarai, that kings will come and go, and that when they do, the road will still be there in the morning. The sarai will still fish your name from the air and put it in the right place in a book, and the man at the toll gate will still ask you for the same coin and accept it without complaint. And so you arrive at the hinge. The Afghan reformer passed too soon. The timorous heir returned just in time. The mechanisms of daily life sway between continuity and erosion. Humayun's tent glows with lamplight as he signs orders. Outside, a runner waits to carry them to a provincial capital. At the sarai, the keeper grumbles about a small theft and resolves to hire a sterner nephew. On the road, a cart's axle creaks and is mended with a sliver of wood. You might ask, as you close this section, a question that belongs to carpenters and emperors alike. When you inherit a sturdy structure built by someone you fought, do you change the joints to make them yours, or do you leave them as they are? Because the strength lies less in whose hand placed the beam than in whether anyone remembers to oil the hinges. The restoration that follows is shy. It does not strut. It arrives in increments. In Kabul, workrooms fill with men sharpening tools and hands that have not had steady employment in years. Coin dies are set into frames and struck with measured blows. You feel the fingertips of a mint worker as he tosses a blank into the die and brings down the hammer, not too hard to crack, not too soft to blur, trained by repetition to read the metal. In Delhi, a new court hums with the manual labor of governance. Turbaned men queue with petitions. Clerks scratch names with steady rhythm. Guards stand, shift their weight, stand again. Humayun walks among them, more careful than he once was. And his officials, many of them trained by routines he did not invent, settle into a schedule that fits his caution. He appoints Bairam Khan to the work he knows must be done firmly. The general's care becomes a climate. Horses are checked with more attention, and when a man reports for pay without a mount that matches the record, he is sent away to find it or to find the truth. Muster rolls are read aloud, a boring recitation that saves coin from leakage. In the provinces, officers who grew slovenly under later Sir rulers find themselves called to account not by the lash, but by the ledger. They must reconcile their claims to their records, and records are much better liars before they smell the breath of someone who asks meditative questions. The imperial kitchen is a measure too. When a kitchen wastes food, often the court is wasting attention. Under the new order, economies appear in the kitchen. Bread is rationed, ghee is measured. The cook's accounts are checked. This is not miserliness. It is exorcism of wasteful habit. Among the people, skepticism meets hope. In the market, a textile merchant considers a shipment to Lahore. He listens to the road talk, the old gossip that is a currency of its own, and hears that the series are open, the wells are kept full, the patrols are alert. He sends a larger consignment than he did last season. A moneylender considers a loan to a landholder to dig a canal spur or repair a bund. He calculates whether tax remission will be honored in case of flood. He asks a district clerk for a copy of last year's order and receives it. He lends, the string that ties the money bag is knotted with more confidence. The river carries certainty one way and contingency another. Ferrymen lay planks across boats and rest a long pole in their hands. They look up at the sky, listen to the talk of upstream rain, and set fares for the day. A court that gives them a schedule gives them courage to set the fare without greed. Men who calculate their risk on the river need to know not only whether the current will pull hard, but whether a toll collector at the far bank will accept the coin and not invent a new charge. Under the revived empire, the boatman's gamble is smaller. He trusts that the day's recipes are fixed. He can train an apprentice without warning him to expect surprises. Not far from the river, a field is marked for remeasurement. The man who carries the rope finds that the knots are placed as they were last year. His hand remembers the motion. A cultivator watches, arms crossed, his face unreadable, until he sees the rope lie across the earth where it did before. He grunts, an expression of something like relief. He will sow again. The pata he holds is not a guarantee against disaster, but it is a hedge against the disaster of arbitrary change. In his house, a woman measures grain into a pot for the day, her thumb rising and falling against the bowls inside to feel whether the measure is generous or mean. She thinks about the tax collector and wonders whether he will ask for what is customary and leave when he has it. She tells her husband to bring home thread. She counts the coins without tasting them with her teeth. Because their faces are familiar now, the court finds its footing in a detail that would be invisible to those who look only upward. Storage. The granaries are inventoried with better care. Spoilage is tracked. Rats are discouraged not only by cats, but by sweeping schedules and the discipline of men, who report a torn sack at once rather than later. In the armory, powder stays drier because someone has finally arranged to keep it off damp floors on low racks. Swords are oiled in the evening, and the oil is recorded so that theft is less tempting. A general who allows his armory to smell of rust is not welcome in the palace anymore. The chiropractor of the state cracks and straightens vertebrae that have been out of alignment for years, and the patient stands a little taller. Human enjoys the modicum of calm that follows a return. He plans within his scale, building projects that mark presence. But time is a skeptic. A day comes when he walks in a library and makes a misstep. People run, people lift. Doctors are called, orders fly. The room smells of lamp oil and parchment. And worry. An emperor's life leaves a shape in air that takes some time to smooth out. The court gathers itself to answer the oldest administrative question: how to keep the machine running while the nameplate changes. Byram Khan's hand grips the lever firmly. The name on the coin will change. The weight must not. The man who keeps watch at the Sarai gate should not change his routine because of a fall in a library. The city adjusts in ordinary ways. A processional route is swept. Contracts for food for ceremonies are written and honored. The schools of recitation prepare their voices. The mint makes dies with a new name and tests them. The officers whisper to each other about what will be different, and then they go to their offices and do what they did yesterday. That they can do so is the point. If you in your own life have ever worked in a place where the manager left and the morning routine did not break, you know this relief. Empires are workplaces where routines are religion. This transition clears the stage for a boy who will, under the hand of his guardian, learn how to be the kind of ruler that turns daily acts into an art form. The return of Humayun and the shape. Left by Sher Shah, the convergence of habit and ambition makes a platform for that boy to stand on. He will be called Akbar, and he will learn how numbers can become loyalties, how days can be woven into a fabric that holds under stress and shimmers in peace. But before he takes the many steps that will make his name a byword for capable rule, the country itself needs to remember that its safety is not in the banners, but in the benches, not in the parades, but in the post stations, not in the proclamations, but in the consistent mediation between tax and toil. To end this story and, yet not end it, to step out of the court again into a district town. The sun sits lower now. A line of men leaves the courthouse yard after a list of cases has been heard and settled, badly or well. A shopkeeper closes his shutters and slides the bar into place. A boy sweeps the step. A headman from a nearby village washes his hands at a public basin, dries them on the edge of his cloth, and folds his papers into a small pouch. Somewhere beyond your hearing, a bell rings at a sarai gate, and a runner finishes his day's route and sits on a stool, rubbing his calves. The machinery that men like Sher Shah built and men like Humayun repaired keeps steady time. You are left in this gentle tick of order, with a question that leans forward into the next reign. When administration becomes culture, can a single generation deepen it into something that survives even longer storms? Or will the graces of peace erode the diligence of men until the next emergency finds a system fat and forgetful of its own best ways? Morning in a regent's camp feels like patience. The boy king wakes, but the empire stretches and yawns through the hands of men older than him. Bairam Khan stands behind the continuity that saved a dynasty, and under him the army advances like a slowly mended garment, stitch after stitch, reinforcing the old weave. The emergency is a Mediatan enemy whose courage is sharpened by opportunity, but the method is familiar. Counting horses, checking stores, making sure powder is dry, bread is baked, roads are clear. Victory arrives at Panipat once more. And though the two battles share a name, the more important shared thing is the dull discipline that makes victory possible. In the months after, the regent keeps the habit of accurate boredom alive until the boy has watched enough to know that this is the work, when Akbar steps forward to rule in his own right. He does not do so with a dramatic change of furniture, but by retuning the same instruments, the Mansab system, the ranking of men by numbers that specify their obligations and their pay, offers a way to tie honor to arithmetic. A man's rank is not merely his face at court. It is the quiver of horses he must present at muster, the number of men he must feed, the account he must settle each quarter. Under his ministers, the dock system brands horses and the chera system records men, boring precautions against the oldest temptations. Officers who used to paper over shortfalls with charm now find their charm less useful. They present what they owe, or they lose what they hold. This is not a romance. It is a job description made binding. Revenue is the empire's breath, and breath must be regular to keep a body from trembling. The new order reaches for a regularization that will let cultivators plan and the state rely on their plans. The revenue survey becomes more systematic, not as a single heroic act, but as a campaign of measuring and recording that lasts years. Land is classified not romantically, but according to its behavior. Pali land sown each year with confidence, Parauti land resting a year under fallow, Shakar land reclaimed with effort after a longer rest, barrier land barren without works that many cannot afford. Men walk and measure and write. The Dasala system, a 10-year average that smooths the jaggedness of weather into a predictable demand, is introduced with tables that must be copied and carried. It is bureaucratic in the truest sense. It summons a class of men who know numbers, and expects their virtue to be their reliability with ink. In a village, this looks like a familiar man arriving at a familiar time with a familiar book. The cultivator knows what to bring to the meeting. He knows how the acre is calculated, how the rate is set, what will be forgiven if a flood or a pest visit his crops. He knows his pata will not change unless a planned process changes it. He knows he can appeal if the process is violated. Knowledge does not make his life easy. It makes it calculable. He can decide whether to sow a more delicate crop because he knows the cost of failure and the reward of success. He can invest in improving water storage because he knows he'll be at the same field long enough to benefit from the improvement. The district becomes the real shape of the state. A founder commands force and a Dewan counts money, and they check each other. Kanangos remember local custom and Patwars remember local facts. And they put these memories into books that travel further than they do. The Suba, the province, receives reports that match in columns across districts if the system works. And when it does not, men walk down the chain to find where the mismatch began. Audit is a boring word that saves lives by preventing rages. Because governors who must account for their accounts cannot afford to grow too whimsical. At the hinge between administration and culture stands the market. Somewhere in a city, a man known as the mutasib watches weights and measures, checks that adulterated goods do not pass as pure, restrains the worst greed of men who know exactly how hungry people can be. He does this by inspection, not by decree. Alone, he walks lanes and talks to men who sell lamp oil and salt and grain. He notes the year's pressure's drought or flood and calibrates his attention accordingly. When the court remits a tax or controls a price in distress, he is the hand that applies that softening to the hard edge of exchange. The market is not merely a place of money. It is a civic organism whose health depends on the tone set from the canopy and the shoes that walk the alleys. In the capital, the fortress palace, a workshop of governance, multiplies tasks into offices. The Karkhana's imperial workshops are not only luxury factories, they are stores and depots. They keep inventory of everything the state uses. Cloth for uniforms, rope for tents and bridges, pots for kitchens, powder for guns, paper for offices. A man whose mind runs to lists finds career and meaning here. He oversees the issuance of a bolt of cloth and notes when the roll runs out. He requests more with a form that identifies the items so precisely there can be no confusion. He knows the day the camel caravan will arrive with a resupply and schedules men to unload it. When he falls ill and another takes his place, the book continues where he left it. This is civilization, the ability to be replaced without collapse. The courts. Culture does not sit apart from this. When a ruler calls scholars to discuss big questions or invites artisans to demonstrate fine skill, he does so within a system that fed them and furnished them and returned them to their work with pay on time. The much-discussed tolerance is here. A tolerance of procedural differences, too, allowing men to settle their own arguments by their own recognizable rules, provided those rules do not break the larger peace. The imperial ear is pitched to the steady sound of order. You watch the rulers sit in public audience, hearing petitions and granting or denying them in a predictable manner. He does this not to play God, but to assert that even at the top, procedure matters. He often sends a petition back down the chain with instructions to fix what the lower office should have fixed. This is theater in the best sense, a performance that changes behavior. On a winter morning, a hunt organized at vast scale looks like an extravagance, and is, but it also looks like a logistical drill. The Camarga, the ring hunt, circles an area. With men spaced at counted intervals and requires more management than a small war. The beaters must walk at the same pace. The ring must tighten at the same time. The distribution of meat afterward must be orderly. The hunt teaches officers to appreciate synchronization and teaches the state to move men without chaos. It has costs and is not a parable of perfect governance, but watched from the angle of the boring. It is a practice session for coordination. Water shapes cities and fields alike, and a thoughtful ruler learns to dredge tanks and clean canals. In the capital, tank keepers rake silt and mend embankments. In rural districts, canal overseers patrol banks in the early morning and the late afternoon when heat is less fierce. They order repairs when a breach begins as a seep rather than waiting for the break. Most of their work consists of training neighbors to report trouble early and rewarding those who do. A proverb grows in a village that a breach is like an illness, better mended at first symptom. This proverb is a policy, and policies that become proverbs last longer than edicts. Travelers move through this world and carry news. A porter hired to carry a nobleman's chest also carries the memory of which posts were well run and which were lax. He tells his cousin in a village about the city's new price of salt and the way the bridge over the river was widened enough to let 2 carts pass without scraping. A grain dealer returning from a provincial capital tells the shopkeeper about the Suba's insistence on punctual pay for garrison troops and the way that insistence prevented the soldiers from plundering the market. These are not official reports. They are the gossip of competence, and they are how credibility is built without proclamations. The young emperor's presence at the center of this quiet storm matters less as a personality and more as a timer. He stays long enough to embed routines, hires men who prefer book to sword for the tasks suited to books, and keeps sword where sword must be. He touches provinces with long visits not only to be seen, but to see, to look at how the regularities he orders are being reheated into local custom. He notices whether a judge is feared or trusted, a distinction only locals can explain. He listens when a district farmer explains why the bunt fails each 3rd year, even though the accounts show equal expenditures each year. He orders an inquiry and perhaps a different mix of clay and straw in the bunt's repair. Perhaps a different headman is appointed. Perhaps the same headman is kept and watched. The decisions are small. The effect accumulates. You close this section as you opened it. Among men and women who do not speak eloquently about the state because they are busy living inside it. A woman cleans her courtyard and lays out grain to dry, glancing at the sky for signs of rain. A man sharpens a plowshare and tells a boy to mind the oxen's yoke. In town, a clerk finishes copying a table of revenue rates and stretches his fingers. In the palace, an officer looks at a schedule of inspections and chooses a week when he can leave without leaving vacuum. The empire is not marble. 'Tis wet clay that dries only if men keep moving air over it. You might ask yourself a question that holds like a peg in this soft wall. Can a ruler make procedure so beloved that men defend it even when he is absent? Or does procedure always need the breath of a present authority to keep its edges from curling? You are asked to imagine not the glory of a throne, but the stubbornness of a calendar. In the middle years of Akbar's rule, the empire reveals itself not in a single resounding policy, but in the slow tightening of predictable turns. Season into season. Audit into audit. Muster into muster. You begin in a district headquarters, where a Diwan sits on a low cot, legs tucked to one side, and works through a stack of reports bundled with string. He moves a bead on a wooden counter, not because he cannot count without it, but because rhythm helps the mind keep to its lane. The desolate tables lie open nearby, a decade's averages made legible for this year's demand. A patwari arrives from the field with a smudged record of plots harvested and plots flooded. His clothes bear the pale stains of dry mud that never quite washes out. He places his book before the Diwan and recites at a regular pace, a chant that has grown familiar to both men. This is the noise of empire, the repeated concord between word and number. The land outside this town is classified, because classification makes mercy possible. Poli takes seed each year, and thus supports a steady assessment. Parauti rests a year by plan, and the assessment rests with it. Shakar lies fallow longer, and is coaxed back with reduced dues. Banyar waits for great labor and receives little. Demand until labor arrives. You trace these categories with your eyes as men with bamboo poles measure boundaries. Their knots tied at fixed intervals, their hands blackened with the dust of the rope. A cultivator watches, his mouth set. He trusts only what returns. He wants to see the rope fall in the same places as last time. When it does, his shoulders drop a little. He might try a riskier crop this year, one that needs more water and more attention, because he believes the share he has promised to the state will hold steady enough for his own share to be worth the trouble. The surveyor, for his part, is paid in coin that rings true and on a schedule that makes the work his identity. Rather than a pause between better things, the chain that binds this field to the court runs through offices you can smell. Ink has a smell, paper has a texture, seal wax has a weight before it hardens. The Kanungo, holder of local custom and memory, checks entries for consistency with how things have always been done in this soil. The Dewan checks for consistency with what is required in this year's schedule. The two are not always the same, and the polite working friction between them produces something like justice by wearing away sharp edges. When a remission is granted after a flood, it is written in thick, deliberate strokes. The state advertises its strength by knowing when to forgive. That forgiveness is a rule too. It has conditions and a form to fill, and the farmer completes the form with the help of a village scribe under a neem tree, both men glad for the little shade. At the level of men and horses, the mansab system finds its own dull elegance. A rank is a number, and a number is a commitment. Mansabders learn that the chera, the register of faces, and the dock, the brand on horses, travel with them, like shadows. The officer who once might have decorated a report now understands that reports are checked. A muster in the open field is a familiar scene. Horses are led past a rope line. Their teeth are examined. Their hooves are lifted. Their backs are checked for sores that would indicate a different kind of work than the one claimed on paper. A clerk calls names. A second clerk marks answers. A third watches both and notes discrepancies. There are no speeches. The music here is the scratch of reed pens and the occasional cough from a horse in the cities. The karkhanas pulse like additional hearts. You step into a storehouse and feel the temperature drop. Racks hold bolts of cloth stamped on the end, with marks that tell their origin and quality. Shelves hold neatly stacked copper pots. Racks hold lances arranged head to tail. Baskets hold rope coils of different thicknesses, tagged with small wooden labels. An overseer reads a requisition. So many lengths of canvas to be issued to the artillery for new covers. So many pots to a garrison kitchen whose inventory shows breakage above the expected rate. He orders an inquiry into whether careless washing is to blame. This is fussy work. It is also the glue that keeps larger things from falling apart. Under Akbar's ministers, the Karkhanas chart a course between careful thrift and necessary availability, a path as narrow and essential as a bridge. Across a monsoon stream, the imperial road network evolves into a habit. Saris mark the great routes like vertebrae, protecting the nervous system of movement, storage, and message. The keeper at each post keeps 2 books, one for the people who have come and gone, one for the provisions issued and replenished. He is evaluated on both. You watch a day's departures as the sun lifts, a caravan eastward with bales of cloth and baskets of spice, a noble's party with bright saddles and a more elaborate series of cooking pots, a runner, barefoot and quick, who takes the imperial packet with no decoration at all. At the gate, the keeper checks permits and pays attention to faces. It has been explained to him in simple terms that his vigilance helps keep the road free of thieves and the market free of fears that make men sell cheap at noon and buy dear at dusk. He enjoys the stability that comes with being respected as a function rather than as a person. When the empire touches ocean, does so with the restraint of a power that prefers land. Yet the sea knocks on the door with more than foam. It knocks with coin. Customs stations at ports become classrooms where administrators learn salt, spray, and ink can share a table. The measure of a bale, the weight of pepper, the count of indigo. Chests all become the numbers by which coastal revenue meets inland revenue in the ledgers of a suba. The mutasib in a port learns to test the adulteration of sugar with water and two-way imported tin against a standard piece that sits on his desk like a small deity of fairness. Mariners of distant flags come and go. They bring goods and require rules. The state stamps its authority not into sales, but into scales. And the scales, when trusted, do a quiet miracle. They make strangers behave. Inside the court, ritual grows into a routine of governance. Public audience is a show that teaches. When the emperor sits to hear petitions, he does more than dispense favors or punishments. He serves as a metronome, setting the beat by which the lower instruments must play. A man presents a complaint about a district officer's harshness. The emperor refers it downward with a margin note that points not to vengeance but to procedure. Investigate, compare with the written rate. Report back with evidence. The man bows, less dazzled than steadied. He will talk in his village about how the great canopy protects by insisting that the small canopy do its job. Access to the top matters less than the example of the top. Religious policy, often sung in higher registers, reads here as administrative habit. Salai Kula general peace tastes like unremarkable inclusion. A Rajput commander takes up a post because his competence suits it. His men draw pay from the same accounts and are marked in the same books. His local customs are noted and preserved where they do not break the larger peace. His temple receives a land grant recorded in the same format as a stipend for a madrasa. Men of different faiths discover their loyalty to forms that treat them with unexcited fairness. The empire does not ask them to feel a certain way. It asks them to show up on time, pay on time, serve on time, and in exchange, it offers predictability. You see this in the way a mixed garrison divides rations and in the way a judge allows parties to bring their own oaths to the same table. Frontiers are where method is tested against improvisation. In Gujarat, the wealth of ports and the quickness of merchants require a more agile enforcement of dues and a more attentive defense against privateurs and opportunists. In Bengals, river labyrinth, boats become barracks, and officers learn the difference between a monsoon's anger and a monsoon's playfulness. At Kandahar, the empire learns again that a fort's strength is a schedule of resupply as much as a wall's thickness. Correspondence with distant posts reads like a patient mother's letters to a child at school. Eat properly. Write regularly. Do not spend wastefully. Avoid quarrels unless necessary. The child answers with lists of needs, and the mother sends what can be spared. Behind each transaction is the mnemonic device of routine. Disaster arrives on schedule, which is to say, seldom with surprise to those who track signs. A poor monsoon shortens the stalks. A locust cloud strips fields. A flood scours buns from their place. Relief has its own procedures, remissions declared and logged. Grain from state stores sold at controlled prices. Loans to cultivators recorded, with an eye toward gentle recovery. The mutasib's inspectors visit markets to prevent hoarding. The police are told to watch for violence at distribution points. The postal relays carry orders that are dull and life-saving. People who live Through such seasons, and most do, remember who kept calm and who profited. They count the quiet men as their protectors, not the loud men in the mid-years. The court learns the art of making itself smaller so that the provinces can be bigger where they must. A good governor is given room to make decisions within the empire's grammar. He balances Faudar and Dewan, hearing both and letting neither run over the other. He supports a judge who shows integrity by displeasing both litigants equally. He mends bridges on the schedule engineers recommend, not on the schedule of festivals alone. His correspondence with the center is a ledger of trust, reports polished enough to be readable and plain enough to be useful. The center, in turn, restrains its desire to meddle in everything, choosing instead to monitor a handful of key indicators: revenue flow, price stability, crime frequency, muster readiness, and to step in only when those waver beyond tolerance. Trade across distances thickens, and with it the empire's sense of itself as a space where strangers can rely on the same answers to the same questions. The caravan that leaves Lahore with textiles, jaggery, and brass vessels arrives weeks later in Patna to discover that the sarai keeper's questions are the same. The toll collector's rate is the same. The court's courtliness is the same. The sameness is a gift. In its shade, regional differences bloom like plants under an even sun. Dialects, cuisines, local crafts. The empire does not need to sand these down. It needs to keep the path between them smooth enough for bargains to cross at day's end. You stand under a lamp in a clerk's room and watch him finish his column. He rubs his eyes. His fingers are stained. He stacks the pages, runs a string through the holes, ties a knot he could tie in the dark. He places the bundle in a chest and sets a weight on the lid. Across the hall, a junior officer of cavalry counts saddles and bridles and writes down that a strap is fraying and must be replaced. A mason notes that a parapet atop a district fort shows a crack that could widen. None of this is the stuff of song. All of it is the stuff of survival. You hear a final sound as he blows out the lamp, a soft exhale, as if the building itself were relieved to sleep. And you are left with a question less thrilling than enduring. If a state's nobility lies in making the ordinary reliable, how? Does it defend itself against the slow seduction of success when numbers begin to feel like inevitabilities rather than promises that must be kept with the same old care? You re-enter the empire at a workshop bench rather than a throne room because that is where lasting decisions are made. A man sits with a pile of coin blanks and a hammer. He lifts, strikes, and the rhythm seems learned from his heart. The coin he strikes bears names and symbols that knit together different regions. But more important than what it says is what it weighs and how it rings. Merchants accept it with only a glance and a tap because trust has been established by repetition. This is the triad that sustains the later Akbari years, a revenue system that aims at fairness and predictability, a military administrative system that ties honor to audit, and a marketplace that clears exchanges without fear. You can enter the revenue system through the field as always, but now you also see it from above, as an arrangement of averages and adjustments that protects the state from the caprice of weather, and the cultivator from the caprice of collectors. The 10-year averages flow down into rates. Remissions flow up as reasons. The two meet in a space supervised by men trained to be skeptical of both excuses and impossible demands. Todar Mal's tables, anonymous to many who benefit from them, make a discipline out of patience. They demand that you wait for a pattern before calling it a law. And then, once you have the law, you do not change it unless the pattern changes. In a culture fond of poetry, this is prose at its most necessary. The Mansab system reaches a maturity that would be dull if it were not so effective. Ranks calibrate expectations. Salaries flow in coin and in assignments. The Cheradok pairing makes it harder to cheat without shame. Officers are transferred to prevent local loyalties from hardening into local empires. Promotions are earned through a blend of seniority and performance that can never seem perfectly fair, but is rarely grotesquely unjust. In musters, you see, continuity across years. The same boy who watched his father's horse be inspected now leads his own to the rope line, proud of the animal's gleaming coat and the fact that its feed came on time. Under such conditions, courage on a battlefield is often a byproduct of good administration rather than a substitute for it. In towns, the muchasib's presence keeps markets from tipping into either chaos or stasis. He visits perfumers to check whether the oil they sell smells so because of flour or fraud. He puts his hand on a butcher's scales and presses lightly to see if the pointer moves as it should. He knows the difference between a famine profiteer and a merchant who must raise prices because his supplier has. His fairness is watched, and his fairness is the foundation of a kind of affection that a state needs more than adoration. Men prefer a system where they can predict decisions over one where they can sometimes win exceptions. The emperor's tolerance of many ways of worship is a reflection of this preference in a higher key. It is a bet that peace will follow the path of predictable procedures, not of forced likeness. The capital's evolutions, whether at Agra or at Fetaphora Sikri speak in masonry, about concerns that are administrative before they are aesthetic. A city laid out with thought for water catchment is a policy, not just a view. A street shaded by colonnades wide enough to allow 2 laden carts to pass is a regulation you can walk on. A circuit of offices placed so that files move in a circle rather than across a maze is a diagram of thought. The entertainment's music, painting, the assembling of learned men to argue require supply chains of paper, pigment, instruments, and diets. The administration uses pleasure as a test. If the kitchen supplies the audience hall, and the audience hall empties into the judiciaries, then men are moving and seeing and thinking in proximity, and sometimes proximity is enough to smooth the edges of competing claims. You see the army in pieces rather than en masse, a company of musketeers drilling on a dusty patch outside town, a cavalry squad practicing turns on a fallow field, a gun crew cleaning barrels under a shade cloth. They are paid at intervals that mirror the seasons, and because the pay arrives close to the times it is due, theft from the countryside is lower than it might be. When arrears creep in, the effect is immediate. Prices at the market jump as soldiers buy on credit. A shopkeeper refuses soldiers he would otherwise serve gladly. A letter goes up the chain. The correction is immediate because men at the center know arrears are rot under the floorboards. They are not ashamed to be called accountants. Their pride is the quiet pride of men whose sums match life. The frontier remains a place where competence prevents catastrophe. In the Deccan, the empire leans south with caution, testing supply lines across challenging terrain where grass grows differently and water behaves in ways unfamiliar to northerners. Garrisons are stocked. Local alliances are courted. The Manseb Jugir mechanisms are used to graft loyal service into unfamiliar soil. Mistakes happen. An officer presses too hard on a district and the people vanish into the hills. Another grows too cozy and harvests locally the loyalty owed to the center. Both are corrected with transfers and audits. The empire learns to use men from the region for tasks that require local knowledge because humility is cheaper than stubbornness. The imperial post becomes the everyday hero of a space too large for any person to see whole. Runners in relays carry packets with folds and seals. Now the timing of their journey is recorded as a way of measuring the empire's pulse. If a route is consistently slow, someone visits. Not to blame, but to find the one broken plank on the bridge or the sarai keeper who drinks too much. The post makes distant events immediate in the only way that improves decision-making, not by panic, but by timely awareness. Governors write knowing when a reply will likely arrive. The center writes knowing when a command will likely be received. The guesswork shrinks, and with it the excuses. in the countryside. You notice that festivals proceed with a calmer air when administration is dependable. Men do not hoard as much grain ahead of a holiday because they believe the market will not be allowed to distort too far. Women walk to wells with less fear of harassment because the constable on the corner is known to make rounds even when the streets are crowded. Temples and mosques repair roofs because grants are honored and respected. A grant is a promise backed by offices. Offices are people who turn up, sit down, and do the same thing in the same way across months and years. The predictability becomes tradition and outlives the people who enforced it. Akbar's insistence on hearing from many voices, philosophical, practical, has its administrative analog in hearing from many districts. He listens for contradictions, not to scold, but to triangulate. If two provinces with similar rainfall and soil report vastly different yields, he asks why and keeps asking until the answer is not a story but a mechanism. Seed quality, bund maintenance, timely sowing. He then translates the answer into a policy that can be explained in a paragraph and measured in a ledger. His court's habit of debate is not an ornament. It is a tool for thinking about systems without mystifying them. You pause at the threshold of night in a provincial town and watch as shutters close and lamps are lit. A police patrol passes, spears tipped with little lamps that glow like fireflies. A judge's scribe covers his ledger with cloth. A road mender stacks his tools against the serai wall and wraps a rope around them. In a courtyard, a woman smears a fresh layer of clay on the floor to keep dust down. None of them will pronounce on governance, yet each will be affected tomorrow by whether the grain measure matches the weight of the coin, whether the toll collector's hand is steady, whether the officer's horse has been shod. This is how a great empire concludes its daily chapter, with everybody doing the small thing in front of them. Because the small thing is the architecture of the large. The resolution you seek here is not a climax, but a consolidation. The empire reaches a plateau where procedure is beloved enough to be defended by those who use it, and simple enough to be taught easily. The Mansab Jagir balance holds. The revenue demand fits within the farmer's hope. The roads remain passable. All the saris remain open. The markets remain honest enough that strangers become familiar. This is the peak, and it does not glitter. It hums. You might ask, as you turn toward the next story, a question that is heavier than it sounds. When an administration succeeds by distributing competence, can it preserve that competence when ambition, austerity, and prolonged war press from different directions? Or will the very regularities that made it strong become brittle under new strains until cracks widen into paths for decline? You enter the next reign not through a burst of trumpets, but through a doorway hung with a curtain that smells faintly of incense and cloth dyed in rich colors. Jahangir sits in audience beneath a canopy that filters daylight into a soft, usable brightness. He inherits a machine that runs, and his first duty is not innovation, but calibration. The karkhanas, the revenue offices, the mansab registers, the saris, the posts, they hum as they did yesterday. The difference you hear is a new texture, the court's love of cataloging nature, weighing curiosities, judging fine art, and measuring men by the subtler weights of discernment. The empire's board emits repetitive virtucantus, now inflected by a taste for recording what the eye sees and the hand touches. In a district office, Doan's fingers turn pages as always, but the paper is better and the ink finer. A painter in the imperial atelier draws a partridge with the same attention the Kanungo pays to boundary lines. The court's aesthetic does not float above administration, it shapes it. When rulers attend closely to detail in art, they often demand detail in audit. Jahangir's eye for the gradations of color becomes a clerk's insistence on the gradations of land. Irrigated or not, sown or not, fallow by plan or by neglect. You notice that the best paintings are dated and inscribed meticulously, a habit. That rhymes with the office's preference for records that travel through time without losing their meaning. Noor Jahan's presence adds a further layer of order. You imagine her hand in a letter ordering the timely delivery of materials for a garden. And you imagine the overseer at the garden reading it with the same focus he would grant a military directive. Gardens are not luxuries here, they're schedules. Written in green, water must be apportioned. Trees planted at intervals calculated to shade and not starve. Paths laid with materials that can be swept to resist monsoon rot. The garden pavilion becomes a place where business is conducted in borrowed coolness, a metaphor that is also a workplace. The grant that gives land to maintain a garden is recorded. The coin that pays the gardeners is weighed, the man who supplies. Gravel is inspected for short measure in his baskets. The Mansab registers still anchor the pyramid of service. Promotions are recorded. Horse brands checked. Jogar reassignments written and sealed. A Rajput noble receives a higher rank after a frontier duty executed well. A Turani commander is posted away from a province where his relatives have thickened. An Iran origin official is placed where his skills in diplomacy are useful. The balance of origins Turani, Irani, Hindi, Rajpute. It is marked in tables. It is upheld by paydays. Personalities circle the throne, but the throne is bound to ledgers. Even when factions contest influence, they do so by arguing that their man will keep the books better. The empire's roads feel smoother not only under cards, but under rumor. The postal relays carry not just imperial commands, but news of the court's preferences. A Subas Dewan hears that the center favors stricter audit this year. He stiffens his checks. A Faudar hears that the center frowns on harsh handling of a certain tribe this season because of a delicate negotiation. He tempers his patrols. These are not whispers of intrigue. They are nudges expressed through the channels that already exist. The Sarai keeper goes on counting heads and issuing fodder. He does not care who has influence at court, as long as the money arrives when it should. Trade thickens across the empire with a sense of security that has a taste you can almost feel it on your tongue in the regularity of salt, the availability of sugar, the predictable price of grain. Port customs in Surat or Hugli go about their dull miracles, weighing bales, stamping papers, counting chests. Inland markets mirror these rhythms. A caravan master in the Deccan knows that by the time he reaches Malwa, the toll rate will match what it was last year. He knows a shortage will bring a controlled adjustment, not a predatory spike. He trusts the Mutasib's shadow. This trust permits profit without outstanding courage. Men prefer such profit. It keeps knives sheathed. Jahangir's taste for nature's order leads to more precise inventories of wildlife and landscape, a habit that blends into the administrative craving for lists that capture the real. A clerk reads a description of a tree's leaf margin with the same interest he brings to the note that a canal bund in his district tends to fail on its western face in the first heavy rain. Knowledge logs become policies. An order goes out to place more stones or to adjust the bund's angle. Men carry baskets of earth and tamp it down with the seriousness of those who have seen water take back what neglect built. The improvement is not sudden, but over years a district notes fewer floods and more dependable yields. The boring file that records this gains quiet prestige. The court's tensions between men, between visions bubble within this framework. When a prince quarrels with a minister, the quarrel finds expression in appointments and transfers rather than in the closure of sarais or the stoppage of pay to garrisons. The state's strength lies in its capacity to compartmentalize conflict. You imagine a weaver in Lahore who cares nothing for which favorite stands this week in the lotus of attention. He cares that the price of indigo holds and that the officials who inspect his cloth understand the difference between a deliberate pattern and a flaw. The state obliges by keeping the same inspectors in place across changes in favor unless corruption forces a switch. On the edges, the empire continues to learn humility. In the Northwest, forts require predictable resupply. In the South, alliances must be renewed with men whose honor codes demand consistency more than gifts. A letter bearing the seal of a royal woman can steady an agreement that might otherwise wobble. A stipend granted to a shrine keeps a local grievance quiet because the shrine feeds the poor who otherwise might look to a rebel for bread. The pragmatic genius here is not soft or sentimental. It is factual. People with full stomachs and predictable hearings at court are less likely to risk everything. The court's attention to these cooking fires and court benches is the equivalent of later rulers' attention to cannons and ramparts. The art of punishment is refined into a deterrent that avoids spectacle where possible. An official found to have shaved measures in the market is dismissed and fined. A fodar who allowed his men to seize grain faces public censure and is posted to a less desirable province. The point is to teach by ordinary pain rather than by dramatic terror. People remember both, but they live in fear of the ordinary one because it is more likely. A city sleeps with a sense that tomorrow will find the same benches in the same shade, the same measures on the same hooks, the same men seated on the same mats. That sameness is a treasure that requires constant polishing. As you close this section, you realize you have walked through a rain often described in colors and perfumes and have found, underneath, the same patient wood and rope and ink. The changes that matter are adjustments to tone and the constancy of tempo. The court collects men and women with eyes for detail and rewards them with influence. The provinces pulse with schedules that make harvests safer and markets steadier. The roads continue to carry information that keeps violence local and order general. You carry forward a question that will lean into the next phase when splendor grows heavier and strain more continuous. Can an empire that makes order feel effortless sustain that feeling when building and war demand more coin, more men, and more attention, or will the effort become visible in ways that change how people breathe under the canopy of rule? You enter a city being written in brick and red sandstone, where lines on paper become walls and canals, and a ruler's taste becomes measurements taken with cords and poles. Shah Jahan's world rises before you in Shah Jahanabad, the new capital, not as a sudden apparition, but as a daily accumulation of deliveries. Carts arrive at dawn, piled with lime for mortar, their sacks damp and cool to the touch. Men with shovels and wicker baskets mix the lime with river sand, turning it until it achieves the quiet pastiness that will hold stones together. Quarrymen at Makrana, far away, cut marble in rectangular slabs, chisels ticking against veins as regular as breathing. In the dry light of Rajasthan, they mark each piece in charcoal, wrap corners with cloth, and send them on journeys that will last longer than a season. You follow the slabs through way stations onto bullock carts that creak under the weight, down gangplanks to boats when the road becomes river, into storage yards where clerks tally pieces against orders copied the day before. The palaces and mosques that will come to define an age stand first in ledger columns. Number of slabs, number of masons, number of baskets of broken brick to fill cores so that the marble can be a skin that gleams and endures. The Red Fort's precincts are a choreography of trades. Masons spread mortar with flat wooden floats and set stones by hand, tapping with mallets until the seams whisper together. Carpenters shape doors whose joints must not warp in monsoon. Metalworkers plate hinges that will swing without complaint for decades. Glaziers cut panes to slot into lattice screens that temper light but do not diminish it. Somewhere beyond your sight, a man sharpens tools in a corner of shade, soaking the stones to keep dust down. Another sits with a bundle of reeds, binding them into brush brooms for sweeping the work platforms. A water carrier fills a terracotta jar and moves along the scaffolds with a measured step, stopping where men call. The bureaucracy beneath these movements persists. Roll calls for paydays. Checks on whether rice and ghee allotments reach the labor quarters. Lists of broken tools exchanged for new. Notes on delays when a boat ran aground on a sandbar and a cargo of timber arrived 3 days late. You stand at the edge of a trench dug for a foundation and see what dominion looks like when you zoom in. A foreman with a cord and plumb bob. A boy with a bucket. A mason with a line of chalk across his palm. The city's arteries are made of waterworks that must be calculated and maintained. Engineers lay out the course of a canal with stakes and sights. The initial angle matters because the river will be indifferent to a ruler's name if the gradient is wrong. You watch men's shoulders deep in a ditch, shaping banks that will resist erosion, and another team nearby, smoothing and tamping pummeled clay to line the channel. Once water runs, it needs watchers, men who patrol embankments twice a day, who know to seep and repair it before it becomes a break, who schedule silt removal by teams with baskets and careful feet. At the city's center, channels feed basins and fountains, and the delight they produce is not trivial. A cool room where business can be transacted in summer heat is a policy, and the garden that provides it is a stone and water statement that governance includes shelter from weather. The gardens schedule water here today. There tomorrow's pinned to a board with counters moved by a stick. It's a small civilizing device that keeps argument to a minimum among the gardeners, many of whom are dealing with plants that will not shade anyone for years in markets, where Chandni Chowk comes into being as an idea of orderly bustle. You move among rows of stalls under awnings stretched tight against sun and rain. Spices in open baskets give off a warmth that is almost visible. Cloth bolts lie in graduated stacks. Metal vessels catch and throw back light in polished curves. The Mughal bore his manwalks with a small entourage and a set of weights. He picks up a stone weight, sets it on a scale, and then asks for grain to be measured against it, watching the pointer settle with a mild expression that masks considerable power. He asks questions in a steady tone. Where did you get this oil? Why is this salt dearer this week than last? When festivals approach, he visits more often. Festivals can draw profit seekers like flies. And vigilance keeps the city's affection for celebration from becoming a frenzy of gouging. Close by, a money changer spreads coins on a mat. His fingers sort by size and design, and when he taps a silver rupee with another, the ring pleases him because it promises that tomorrow's exchange rate will not require a fight. Beyond the capital campaigns in the Deccan require the old arithmetic with new patience. Sieges lean on availability, wood for gabions and mantlets, earth for ramp construction, hides to cover siege engines against sparks, powder that must be kept dry in a climate that will not always cooperate, rations that must arrive on schedule so that the men who dig and heave do not dig and heave on an empty stomach. You walk through a camp built like a city, a quarter for artillery with its low mounds of shot and lines of barrels under canvas, a quarter for cavalry where picket ropes stretched between stakes and horses nod under fly whisks, kitchens arranged by regiment, each with a responsible man who keeps a ledger of flour, ghee, salt, and spices, and who does not permit his men to borrow today against tomorrow unless tomorrow is certain. The bakshi's office pay rolls, inspections ease. A dull hut where the destiny of an army is shaped by the absence of embezzlement. Men line up to show their faces, to show their horses, to receive a sum that allows them to buy food in the camp bazaar without stealing it. Around them, a tiny economy ticks. Potters selling clay cups that will be tossed after use. Barbers shaving. Heads to keep lice down. Washermen thumping clothes in river shallows downstream of where the water carriers fill skins for cooking. Inside provinces not graced by marble. The state's health is measured by the speed of coin and the steadiness of grain. A poor monsoon in the early years of this reign throws the balance out. You place yourself in a district market where the chatter is brittle, prices climb. Men buy in small, frightened amounts. Orders arrive to open granaries and sell at set prices. A stone is placed beside the scale, a little sign hung to show the rate for the day. Police are told to keep clubs on shoulders, but hands at sides. A Dewan signs remissions for villages where the flood took the bund last year and fear lingers. He sends a clerk with a copy of the remission to be kept in the village chest. The clerk sits under a tree, drinks water from a clay cup, and reads the remissions slowly to men who have heard such things before and believe them only. If they find the same words written in the same hand on paper that smells like the office where it was issued, reputation travels slower than rumor, but lasts longer. The Port Surat, that's a Hugly become classrooms where inland administrators learn a new dialect of the same old language. Weight, measure, schedule, enforcement. Ships crowd the roadsteads, their flags speaking of distant courts. Bales and chests move from wharf to warehouse and back again under the eyes of customs men who count and stamp and to maintain a list of exemptions and dues so that a pepper porter does not need to argue with a silk broker about whose tariff applies. The empire does not master the sea, but it masters the counting of what the sea brings and takes. The coins that end up in the mint because of this traffic do not mean extravagance only. They mean payroll met, bridges repaired, courts seated. On time. If you stand in a mint on a hot afternoon, the hammering is relentless. And you understand that sound better than any proclamation. Shah Jahan's court spends as it builds, not only on palaces, but on the machinery of public peace. Weights and measures are inspected. Patrol routes in cities are retraced and ensured. Petty theft declines because the probability of being caught on a Tuesday afternoon is high. The city's police, the Kotwal's men, walk lanes in pairs, ask questions politely where necessary, and keep close with the mutasib when a market argument threatens to turn into a fight. The ordinary piece is thick. You can slice it. This thickness is expensive in work rather than in coin, and it depends on supervisors who value boring consistency over flashy shows of severity. Inside the Mansab Jagir system, pressure builds like water behind a dam. Appointments multiply to satisfy the claims of men who have served long and expect promotion. Campaigns require broader participation and thus broader reward. The pool of joggers' revenue assignments must be divided more finely. You sit with a revenue officer who stares at a map layered with assignments and size. He knows that a joggery assigned to one man this year must be reassigned next year to keep the system from ossifying. He knows the holder has loaned money to village headmen, who will be caught short if they must renegotiate under a new master. He knows fraud lurks where change is rapid and oversight tires. The answer is more visits, more inspections, more counting. He sends men out with ropes and books. He receives them back with dust in their hair and numbers in their margins. The system survives because people do their jobs under watch. And because the watch is watched, the city finishes itself in phases. Jama Masjid, great courtyard open to sky, becomes a calendar and a map. Morning light slants across white and red. Afternoon shade pulls people into striping that makes even crowds look organized. On Fridays, the market lanes near it fill with a measured enthusiasm. You take a place on the mosque steps and listen to what the city is talking about. The price of ghee. The delay on the western road because a bridge has been half-washed and is under repair. A new rule that the toll collector must accept coin from a certain mint without a discount. The rumor that the emperor will proceed along the riverfront on the next full moon. The riverfront itself is functional beauty, ghats paved to minimize. Slipping steps angled to ease water flow. chains set into stone to tether boats without chafing. Boatmen keep their own regulations, but the state frames them. No berthing in certain spots. No dumping ash upstream of intakes. A limit on how many carts may crowd the ramp at once. The beauty of the place is its stability. Inside households, the imperial rhythm is experienced as predictability of ingredients. A kitchen purchases lentils by weight from the same man each week. A woman reaches into a jar for fennel and knows her husband will bring more from market day because he returned last time with a little extra. A boy lights a lamp and goes to a tutor's room without fear his path will be blocked by a commotion. Marriage contracts are written under the same rules as last year. Property agreements once made are enforced without caprice. These ordinary comforts give splendor its audience. A palace is admired by people who slept safely. Otherwise, it is resented as a stone piled up by men who do not understand the price of bread. A darkness visits and visitations pass. Grief and relief take turns. When plague or fever strikes, it strikes as uncertainty in daily schedules. Shop shutters stay down. The mutasib walks more quickly. The Kotwal enforces curfews that move like shutters across neighborhoods. Gravediggers and washermen work more. The state issues orders to clean drains, to sweep more often, to keep markets separate on certain days. You count success here by the return of the ordinary soundscape. Hawkers calling in their habitual rhythms. Temple bells and prayer calls sounding again like a timetable rather than alarms. Recovery is less a miracle than a stubbornness. People doing the same thing with the same care after interruption. The great building of a tomb that becomes legend is also a rehearsal of administrative patience. The Taj is a supervisory masterpiece as much as an artistic one. Subcontracts within contracts, stone cut here, carved there, inlaid elsewhere. Assembled under someone who must coordinate tasks that cannot be rushed without being ruined. You stand in a yard and watch men cut petrodora pieces, tiny leaves and petals of colored stone, their eyes narrowed, their fingers bandaged to keep skin from cracking. A foreman calls out the day's targets and the sequence in which pieces must arrive at the site. A clerk marks down how many were finished and how many failed a quality check. Beyond all this, a lightly drawn line runs through every day. The fact that wages must be paid on time or morale will fray. The largest project in the land is kept alive by hundreds of quiet decisions and thousands of tiny beats of competence. Yet, the empire you now perceive, with its proud regularity, begins to show seams where tension gathers. The Jagger system groans under its own arithmetic. The Deccan absorbs men and money without giving back proportionately. Port customs and inland duties are rearranged to meet needs that sometimes pulse unpredictably. You walk a road where more checkpoints than before, ask for slips of paper. Post runs as always, but messengers complain that a new clerk at a relay demands signatures in a slightly different way that costs a few minutes more each trip. None of this is collapse. All of it is drag. Competence can bear drag for a long time. But you end this section with a practical doubt shaped like a stone in a shoe. When splendor needs more coin and war needs more men. Can the routines that make daily peace continue to be funded, watched, and loved? Or do they begin, one post at a time, one ledger at a time? Two run a little loose until looseness becomes a fashion rather than a fault. You step into a camp that is both familiar and transformed larger, harder, more austere. The war of succession has rearranged faces and insignia. Couriers came and went in a storm. Arsenals were opened, emptied, and replenished. When Aurangzeb sits to govern, the tent poles are set in a slightly different formation. The tone is restrained. The hours are kept with more severity. The entertainments slim. Audits sharpen their teeth. The Boxy's office acquires a new chill. Salaries must be justified with paperwork that is crisp. Horses must be produced at muster with brands impeccable. Officers learn that a late return is an offense against the calendar, not merely against a man's temper. You hear fewer songs at dusk and more recitations of rules. The camp's markets are quieter by design. A ruler's piety is not your subject here so much as his taste for unornamented procedure. The court looks with favor on accuracy, and men begin to frame their petitions in the dry language of compliance. The Deccan becomes a drumbeat that will not stop. Supply lines lengthen. Bullock carts grind at a speed no proclamation can accelerate. Grass does not grow where it is needed because grass has its own weather. Rain arrives and leaves as it pleases. In this reality, the empire fights not only opponents but terrain and time. The solutions remain ordinary. Camps move by schedule. Baggage is arranged with a care that puts powder and food under separate coverings. Bridge-building teams travel in advance. Engineers train local labor in their ways. Ferries are created out of boats and planks again and again. The cost is hours and carefulness and repetition. The measure of an army's fitness becomes whether it can be itself in a place where it would prefer not to be. Behind the front, a line of offices and depots must reload the machine. Mints must produce. Revenue must be collected. Markets must not be so frightened by requisitioning that they collapse. At the top, a more austere legal tone filters through courts. Cadis preside with rulebooks at their elbows. A compilation of rulings circulates to create a common floor. Certain levies and exemptions are readjusted. Certain practices are restricted or recorded differently. The effect on daily life is not in slogans, but in how disputes are framed. Litigants phrase claims in terms they believe the court prefers. Officials draw boundaries of permissible with a stricter chalk. In some places, temples are demolished under particular orders, and in others, endowments to religious institutions of many kinds continue. Both realities recorded in the same registers, by men whose job is to enter what they are told in neat lines. Policy is written in acts. Acts are recorded in ledgers. Ledgers shape expectation. This is the plain mechanics of power. The Mansab system inflates at the top and thins at the bottom. More men carry higher ranks with fewer resources attached to them. Jagirs are carved into smaller parcels. Transfers and reassignments happen so often that fatigue edges into cynicism. You sit with a Jagirdar who decamps to a new assignment reluctantly. He knows he will have to renegotiate everything with new headman. He knows he will be watched by an officer who may not know the district. He carries his account books carefully and wonders if the new lands collection will meet his pay obligations to his men. He does not plan rebellion. He plans survival. In the same district, cultivators watch for signs that this new intermediary will be harsher or softer. They adjust planting strategies accordingly, choosing less risky crops if they sense demands will be inflexible. The system does not break. It loses resilience the way a rope loses spring. On the Deliagra axis, routine holds, though thinner. Police patrols still tread their paths, but occasionally a corner darkens. The Mutasib still tests weights, but his visits grow less frequent where his staff is cut. Sarais still open at dawn and call the register, but a roof repair waits through. One more monsoon because the carpenter's pay is late. In markets, money changes hands by the same gestures, and for most days, the rhythm seems unchanged. Which is exactly how societies endure extended strain, by making today resemble yesterday enough to quiet fear. Yet, details accumulate and talk. A toll gate now asks to see a paper that it spared last year. A postal relay complains of runners absconding to join armies in the South because the military pay, though uncertain, promises a different kind of adventure. A garrison buys more on credit. A shopkeeper who once extended credit to men in uniform hesitates, rebellions occur not only because ideas burn, but because systems tire. In Jat country, in the shadow of fortresses and gardens, groups of men who know the land intimately disrupt roads and tax posts. In central India, the Satnamese artisans and cultivators, bound more by practice than by ideology, push back against officials whose demands feel sharper than customary. In Punjab, the Sikh community hardens its self-defense after a martyrdom, and the steady pressure of interference. These uprisings are suppressed with force. Administration is reimposed. Records are reconstituted. But the pattern teaches an administrative lesson as old as irrigation. Pressure must be released where a system is weakest, and repairs should be made early, not late. Often they are made by officers who understand their districts well, and who cut local rates or change personnel with practical intent. But the need for men and money at the front steels the center's jaw and shortens its patience for such local flex. The ports continue to hum, and the grain of the empire's economy grows finer. Bengal's looms expand, weaving cloth that crosses bays and seas. Gujarat's brokers bargain in a dozen tongues. Coastal customs registers tally goods whose names sound like travel themselves. Silver still flows from foreign trade, and mints keep pace, but remittances to the center from some provinces slow as governors sit heavier in their seats, keeping more to fund local obligations to guard against the next shortage of coins or men. You see the beginnings of regional habit hardening. A governor chooses a trusted accountant, promotes a local captain, promises a saint's shrine a certain sum each year. And in these small bonds, he becomes the axis around which his province turns. The center, busy elsewhere, tolerates this as long as tribute arrives and the law is not mocked in the open. In the Deccan, a different kind of resilience organizes under Maratha leadership. Mobile, familiar with terrain, willing to tax by movement more than by fortification. They raid supply lines, demand chaff, teach the empire that control of nodes is not control of networks. The imperial response is methodical. More forts, more garrisons, moving columns, escorts for convoys. A reworking of routes to avoid predictable ambush points. Each response has its ledger line. Wages paid, powder issued, horses shod, bridges repaired. The campaign stretches over years that could have been used to deepen the old regularities elsewhere. Armies can carry schools of administration with them writing camps that record and transmit, but their main business is not the cultivation of ordinary places. This neglect is not malicious, it is mathematical. Attention spent here cannot be spent there. You return to the towns that have been your barometer. A kotwal issues an order that lanterns be hung at intersections at night, and another that shop shutters be reinforced after a spate of break-ins. A mutasib recruits 2 extra assistants from local guilds to inspect during festivals. Dewan grants remission in 3 villages after a hailstorm ruins early wheat and records the remission twice, once in the district book and once in a book that will travel to the provincial capital. The system still behaves like itself when given the opportunity. What phrase it are not its principles, but its interruptions. An official transferred too quickly. A post underfunded too long. A market too often disturbed by soldiers buying on credit and paying late. Toward the end of this long, disciplined reign, time extracts its final tariff as much from the ruler as from his structures. An aging emperor spends months and years under canvas in the south. Petitions wait longer. The metronome at the center beats muffled. Princes and officers look a little more to their own enclaves. When the inevitable death comes, the succession storm passes through at familiar speed. Couriers gallop, arsenals open and close, lists are rewritten, oaths are taken. The first measure of a state is how much of its normal day survives the night after a death. Much survives. Much also reshapes. Governors who had become local suns shine brighter. Men with paper in their hands negotiate with men holding keys and spears. In the decades that follow, the slow unraveling is domesticated into habit. Provinces with names that will later become kingdoms begin to call their own cadence. Hyderabad grows its court with accountants who answer first to local priorities. Bengal rearranges revenue into streams that satisfy both center and coast, but increasingly answer to its own calculations. Awadh builds patronage that employs more artisans and guards than before. Rajput houses weigh old alliances against newer gratifications. The empire remains a vocabulary all understand: coin, measure, petition, remission. Muster-but languages begin to develop accents. Roads are still patrolled, saras still open, mints still strike, courts still sit, and yet you hear more conversations. About exceptions, more negotiations over the edges of rules. Merchants adapt first, as merchants do. They hire private guards for caravans on stretches of road that feel less well watched. They join with each other to purchase grain ahead of scarcity. They invest in warehouses where once they preferred to keep goods in motion. They learn which. Provincial courts will enforce contracts without calls to distant authority. Villages adjust, too. Community labor restores bunds more often without waiting for district orders. Headmen cultivate favor with both provincial and imperial officers. Families diversify crops to spread risk, growing not only the staple that fed their grandparents, but also something that can be traded for cash. When the tax collector's hand feels heavier, factories on the coast, the fortified, or warehouses of foreign companies present a new kind of neighbor. They buy cloth and saltpeter and opium and pepper with coins that do not complain. They ask permission and then ask for humility from those who granted it. They build walls and guns around goods and then around ideas. At first, they are one more set of houses near the water that pay duties at scales decided by state men's scales. Later, their scales matter more in small places and then in larger ones. Still, for the world you have been walking through, their presence is an adjustment, more than a replacement. Most people sell the same things to the same neighbors for the same coin and speak to the same constable. When the same argument erupts in the same alley, the decline you are charting is made of normal days. That feels slightly less confident then. 10 years ago, a judge arrives 20 minutes late. A bridge's repair waits until after one more monsoon. A patrol comes through twice a night instead of 3 times. A remission requested in August is granted in November instead of October. The miracle is that the old machinery continues to run at all. The disappointment is that its tempo is less. Loved, you have watched splendor rise through organized material. You have followed strain-stretching officials and people. You have listened for the old hum and heard it, always, but softer. You close this long story in a way that does not bow to the drama of either collapse or nostalgia. In the late evening, a sarai keeper checks his book and sighs because 2 runners have not arrived on time. He leaves space for their names and orders the gate closed with the usual ceremony. In a district town, a mutasib leans on his stick and watches a butcher wrap meat in a leaf, weighs it again in his head because practice has given him that skill, and nods. He will write, tomorrow, a letter suggesting that inspections be increased before the next feast day. In a village, men lift a broken bunt stone together and set it back in place, singing under their breath to match their steps. In the capital, a clerk ties a stack of petitions with string and places them in a box labeled with a date and a name. The box will travel to a different palace than it would have in your grandfather's time. But the string's knot is tied the same way. You are left with a question that speaks to any age that inherits both splendor and systems. If the health of a polity lies in routines that make fairness feel ordinary, how do you persuade each new generation to cherish those routines with the same dull devotion when splendor distracts, strain exhausts, and the temptation to improvise seduces from every edge.